Chapter XXVII of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XXVII. And the next morning came the wake-up for which Dowie had so long waited and prayed, but not as Dowie had expected it or in the way she had thought nature. She had scarcely left her charge during the night, though she had pretended that she had slept as usual in an adjoining room. She stole in and out. She sat by the bed and watched the face on the pillow and thanked God that, strangely enough, the child slept. She had not dared to hope that she would sleep, but before midnight she became still and fell into a deep, quiet slumber. It seemed deep, for she ceased to stir, and it was so quiet that once or twice Dowie became a little anxious and bent over her to look at her closely and listen to her breathing. But though the small white face was always a touching sight, it was no whiter than usual, and her breathing, though low and very soft, was regular. "But where the strength's to come from, the good God alone knows," was Dowie's inward sigh. The clock had just struck 1 when she leaned forward again. What she saw would not have disturbed her if she had not been overstrung by long anxiety. But now, after the woeful day, in the middle of the night with the echo of the clock's solitary sound still in the solitary room, in the utter stillness of moor and castle emptiness, she was startled almost to fright. Something had happened to the pitiful face. A change had come over it, not a change which had stolen gradually, but a change which was actually sudden. It was smiling. It had begun to smile that pretty smile which was a very gift of God in itself. Dowie drew back and put her hand over her mouth. "Oh!" she said. "Can she be going in her sleep?" But she was not going. Even Dowie's fright saw that in a few moments more. Was it possible that a mist of colour was stealing over the whiteness, or something near colour? Was the smile deepening and growing brighter? Was that caught breath something almost like a little sob of a laugh, a tiny ghost of a sound, more like a laugh than any other sound on earth? Dowie slid down upon her knees and prayed devoutly, clutching at the robe of pity and holding hard, as women did in crowds nearly 2000 years ago. "Oh, Lord Jesus," she was breathing behind the hands which hid her face. "If she can dream what makes her smile like that, let her go on, Lord Jesus. Let her go on." When she rose to her chair again and seated herself to watch, it almost awed. It did not fade, the smile. It settled into a still radiance and stayed. And, fearful of the self-deception of longing as she was, Dowie could have sworn as the minutes passed that the mist of colour had been real and remained also, and even made the whiteness a less deathly thing. And there was such a naturalness in the strange smiling that it radiated actual peace and rest and safety. When the clock struck 3 and there was no change, and still the small face lay happy upon the pillow, Dowie at last even felt that she dare steal into her own room and lie down for a short rest. She went very shortly, thinking she would return in half an hour at most. But the moment she lay down her tired eyelids dropped, and she slept as she had not slept since her first night at Darreuch Castle. When she awakened it was not with a start or sense of anxiety, even though she found herself sitting up in the broad morning light. She wondered at her own sense of being rested and really not afraid. She told herself that it was all because of the smile she had left on Robin's face, and remembered as her own eyes closed. She got up and stole to the partly open door of the room and looked in. All was quiet still. Robin herself seemed very still, but she was awake. She lay upon her pillow with a long curly plait trailing over one shoulder, and she was smiling as she had smiled in her sleep, softly, wonderfully. "I thank God for that," Dowie thought as she went in. The next moment her heart was in her throat. Dowie," Robin said, and she spoke as quietly as Dowie had ever heard her speak in all their life together. "Donal came." "Did he, my lamb?" said Dowie, going to her quickly but trying to speak as naturally herself. "In a dream?" Robin slowly shook her head. "I don't think it was a dream. It wasn't like one. I think he was here. God sometimes lets them come just sometimes, doesn't He? Since the war there have been so many stories about things like that. People used to come to see the Duchess and sit and whisper about them. Lady Maureen Darcy used to go to a place where there was a woman, quite a poor woman, who went into a kind of sleep and gave her messages from her husband, who was killed at Liege only a few weeks after they were married. The woman said he was in the room, and Lady Maureen was quite sure it was true because he told her things no one knew but themselves. She said it kept her from going crazy. It made her quite happy." "I've heard of such things," said Dowie, valiantly determined to keep her voice steady and her expression unalarmed. "Perhaps they are true. Now that the other world is so crowded with those that found themselves there sudden, perhaps they are crowded so close to earth that they try to speak across to the ones that are longing to hear them. It might be. Lie still, my dear, and I'll bring you a cup of good hot milk to drink. Do you think you could eat a new laid egg and a shred of toast?" "I will," answered Robin. "I will." She sat up in bed and the faint colour on her cheeks deepened and spread like a rosy dawn. Dowie saw it and tried not to stare. She must not seem to watch her too fixedly whatsoever alarming thing was happening. "I can't tell you all he said to me," she went on softly. "There was too much that only belonged to us. He stayed a long time. I felt his arms holding me. I looked into the blue of his eyes just as I always did. He was not dead. He was not an angel. He was Donal. He laughed and he made me laugh too. He could not tell me now where he was. There was a reason, but he said he could come because we belonged to each other, because we loved each other so. He said beautiful things to me." She began to speak very slowly, as if in careful retrospection. "Some of them were like the things Lord Coombe said, but when Donal said them they seemed to go into my heart and I understood them. He told me things about England needing new souls and new strong bodies. He loved England. He said beautiful, beautiful things." Dowie made a magnificent effort to keep her eyes clear and her look straight. It was a soldierly thing to do, for there had leapt into her mind memories of the fears the great physician who had taken charge of poor young Lady Maureen. "I am sure he would do that sure of it," she said without a tremor in her voice. "It's only things like that he's thought of his whole life through. And surely it was love that brought him back to you both." She wondered if she was not cautious enough in saying the last word, but her fear was a mistake. "Yes, both," Robin gave back and with a new high bravery. "Both," she repeated. "He will never be dead again and I shall never be dead. When I could not think, it used to seem as if I must be. Perhaps I was beginning to go crazy like poor Lady Maureen. I have come alive." "Yes, my lamb," answered Dowie with a fine courage. "You look it. We'll get you ready for your breakfast now. I will bring you the egg and toast a nice crisp bit of hot buttered toast." "Yes," said Robin. "He said he would come again and I know he will." Dowie bustled about with inward trembling. Whatsoever strange thing had happened, perhaps it had awakened the stunned instinct in the girl. Perhaps some change had begun to take place and she would eat the bit of food. That would be sane and healthy enough in any case. The test would be the egg and the crisp toast. The real test. Sometimes a patient had a moment of uplift and then it died out too quickly to do good. But when she had been made ready and the tray was brought, Robin ate the small breakfast without shrinking from it, and the slight colour did not die away from her cheek. The lost look was in her eyes no more. Her voice had a new tone. The exhaustion of the night before seemed mysteriously to have disappeared. Her voice was not tired, and she herself was curiously less languid. Dowie could scarcely believe the evidence of her ears when, in the course of the morning, she suggested that they should go out together. "The moor is beautiful to day," she said. "I want to know it better. It seems as if I had never really looked at anything." One of the chief difficulties Dowie often found she was called upon to brace herself to bear was that in these days she looked so pathetically like a child. Her small heart shaped face had always been rather like a baby's, but in these months of her tragedy her youngness at times seemed almost cruel. If she had been 10 years old she could scarcely have presented herself to the mature vision as a more touching thing. It seemed incredible to Dowie that she should have so much of life and suffering behind and before her and yet look like that. It was not only the soft curve and droop of her mouth and the lift of her eyes. There was added to these something as indescribable as it was heart moving. It was the thing before which Donal, boy as he was, had trembled with love and joy. He had felt its tenderest sacredness when he had knelt before her in the wood and kissed her feet, almost afraid of his own voice when he poured forth his pleading. There were times when Dowie was obliged to hold herself still for a moment or so, lest it should break down her determined calm. It was to be faced this morning when Robin came down in her soft felt hat and short tweed skirt and coat for walking. Dowie saw Mrs. Macaur staring through a window at her, with slightly open mouth, as if suddenly struck with amazement which held in it a touch of shock. Dowie herself was obliged to make an affectionate joke. "Your short skirts make such a child of you that I feel as if I was taking you out to walk in the park and I must hold your hand," she said. Robin glanced down at herself. "They do make people look young," she agreed. "The lady downstairs looked quite like a little girl when she went out in them. But it seems so long since I was little." She walked with Dowie bravely, though they did not go far from the castle. It happened that they met the doctor driving up the road which twisted in and out among the heath and gorse. For a moment he looked startled, but he managed to control himself quickly and left his dog cart to his groom so that he might walk with them. His eyes, at once grave and keen, scarcely left her as he strolled by her side. When they reached the castle he took Dowie aside and talked anxiously with her. "There is a change," he said. "Has anything happened which might have raised her spirits? It looks like that kind of thing. She mustn't do too much. There is always that danger to guard against in case of sudden mental stimulation." "She had a dream last night," Dowie began. "A dream!" he exclaimed disturbedly. "What kind of dream?" "The dream did it. I saw the change the minute I went into her this morning," Dowie answered. "Last night she looked like a dying thing after one of her worst breakdowns. This morning she lay there peaceful and smiling and almost rosy. She had dreamed that she saw her husband and talked to him. She believed it wasn't a common dream, that it wasn't a dream at all. She believes he really came to her." Dr. Benton rubbed his chin, and there was a serious anxiety in the movement. Lines marked themselves on his forehead. "I am not sure I like that. Not at all sure. In fact, I am sure I don't like it. One can't say what it may lead to. It would be better not to encourage her to dwell on it, Mrs. Dowson." "The one thing that's in my mind, sir," Dowie's respectfulness actually went to the length of hinting at firmness, "is that it's best not to discourage her about anything just now. It brought a bit of natural colour to her cheeks and it made her eat her breakfast, which she hasn't been able to do before.
"They must be fed, sir," with the seriousness of experience. "You know that better than I do." "Yes, yes, they must have food." "She suggested the going out herself," said Dowie. "I thought she'd be too weak and listless to move and they ought to have exercise." "They must have exercise," agreed Dr. Benton, but still he rubbed his chin. "Did she seem excited or feverish?" "No, sir, she didn't. And that was the strange thing. It was me that was excited, though I kept quiet on the outside. At first it frightened me. I was afraid of what you're afraid of, sir. It was only her not being excited and speaking in her own natural voice that helped me to behave as sense told me I ought to. She was happy. That's what she looked and what she was." She stopped a moment here and looked at the man. Then she decided to go on because she saw chances that he might, to a certain degree, understand. "When she told me that he was not dead when she saw him, she said that she was not dead any more herself, that she had come alive. If believing it will keep her feeling alive, sir, wouldn't you say it could be a help?" The doctor had ceased rubbing his chin, but he looked deeply thoughtful. He had several reasons for thoughtfulness in connection with the matter. In the present whirl of strange happenings in a mad war torn world, circumstances which would have once seemed singular seemed no longer because nothing was any longer normal. He realised that he had been by no means told all the details surrounding this special case, but he had understood clearly that it was of serious importance that this girlish creature's child should be preserved. He wondered how much more the finely mannered old family nurse knew than he did. Her vitality must be kept up, but nothing could be worse than inordinate grief, he said. We must not lose any advantage, but she must be closely watched. "I'll watch her, sir," answered Dowie, "and every order you give I'll obey like clockwork. May I take the liberty of saying that I believe it's best if you don't mention the dream to her?" "Perhaps you are right. On the whole I think you are. It's not wise to pay attention to hallucinations." He did not mention the dream to Robin, but his visit was longer than usual. After it he drove down the moor thinking of curious things. The agonized tension of the war, he told himself, seemed to be developing new phases, mental, nervous, psychic, as well as physiological. What unreality, or previous unknown reality, were they founded upon? It was curious how much one had begun to hear of telepathy and visions. He himself had been among the many who had discussed the psychopathic condition of Lady Maureen Darcy, whose black melancholia had been dispersed like a cloud after her visits to a little sewing woman who lived over an oil dealer's shop in the Seven Sisters Road. He also was a war tortured man mentally, and the torments he must conceal beneath a steady professional calm had loosened old shackles. Good God! If there is help of any sort for such horrors of despair, let them take it where they find it, he found himself saying aloud to the emptiness of the stretches of heath and bracken. The old nurse will watch. Dowie watched faithfully. She did not speak of the dream, but as she went about doing kindly and curiously wise things, she never lost sight of any mood or expression of Robin's, and they were all changed ones. On the night after she had "come alive," they talked together in the Tower room somewhat as they had talked on the night of their arrival. A wind was blowing on the moor and making strange sounds as it whirled round the towers and seemed to cry at the narrow windows. By the fire there was drawn a broad low couch heaped with large cushions, and Robin lay upon them looking into the red hollow of coal. "You told me I had something to think of," she said. "I am thinking now. I shall always be thinking." "That's right, my dear," Dowie answered with her sane kindliness. "I will do everything you tell me, Dowie." I will not cry any more and I will eat what you ask me to eat. I will sleep as much as I can and I will walk every day. Then I shall get strong." "That's the way to look at things. It's the brave way," Dowie answered. "What we want most is strength and good spirits, my dear." "That was one of the things Donal said," Robin went on quite naturally and simply. "He told me I need not be ill. He said a rose was not ill when a new bud was blooming on it. That was one of the lovely things he told me. There were so many." "It was a beautiful thing to be sure," said Dowie. To her wholly untranscendental mind, long trained by patent facts and duties, any suggestion of the occult was vaguely ominous. She had spent her early years among people who regarded such things with terror. In the stories of her youth those who saw visions usually died or met with calamity. That their visions were, as a rule, gruesome and included pale and ghastly faces and voices hollow with portent was now a supporting recollection. "He was not dead. He was not an angel. He was Donal," Robin had said in her undoubting voice. And she had stood the test that real test of earthly egg and buttered toast. Dowie was a sensible and experienced creature and had been prepared before the doctor's suggestion to lose no advantage. If the child began to sleep and eat her food and the fits of crying could be controlled, why should she not be allowed to believe what supported her? When her baby came she'd forget less natural things. Dowie knew how her eyes would look as she bent over it, how they would melt and glow and brood and how her childish mouth would quiver with wonder and love. Who knew but that the Lord himself had sent her that dream to comfort her because she had always been such a loving, lonely little thing with nothing but tender goodness in her whole body and soul? She had never had an untender thought of anybody but for that queer dislike of his lordship, and when you came to think of what had been forced into her innocent mind about him, who wondered? And she was beginning to see that differently too in these strange days. She was nothing now but softness and sorrow. It seemed only right that some pity should be shown to her. Dowie noticed that she did not stay up late that night and that when she went to bed she knelt a long time by her bedside saying her prayers. Oh, what a little girl she looked, Dowie thought, in her white nightgown with her long curly plait hanging down her back tied with a blue ribbon. And she to be the mother of a child that was no more than one herself. When all the prayers were ended and Dowie came back to the room to tuck her in, her face was marvellously still looking and somehow remotely sweet as if she had not quite returned from some place of wonderful calm. She nestled into the softness of the pillow with her hand under her cheek and her lids dropped quietly at once. "Good night, Dowie dear," she murmured. "I am going to sleep." To sleep in a moment or so Dowie saw she went, with the soft suddenness of a baby in its cradle. But it could not be said that Dowie slept soon. She found herself lying awake listening to the wind whirling and crying round the tower. The sound had something painfully human in it, which made her conscious of a shivering inward tremor. "It sounds as if something that has been hurt and is cold and lonely wants to get in where things are human and warm," was her troubled thought. It was a thought so troubled that she could not rest and in spite of her efforts to lie still she turned from side to side listening in an abnormal mood. "I'm foolish," she whispered. "If I don't get hold of myself I shall lose my senses. I don't feel like myself. Would it be too silly if I got up and opened a tower window?" She actually got out of her bed quietly and crept to the tower room and opened one. The crying wind rushed in and past her with a soft cold sweep. It was not a bitter wind, only a piteous one. "It's come in," she said, quaking a little, and went back to her bed. When she awakened in the morning she realised that she must have fallen asleep as quickly as Robin had, for she remembered nothing after her head had touched the pillow. The wind had ceased and the daylight found her herself again. "It was silly," she said, "but it did something for me as silliness will sometimes. Walls and shut windows are nothing to them. If he came he came without my help. But it pacified the foolish part of me." She went into Robin's room with a sense of holding her breath, but firm in her determination to breathe and speak as a matter of fact woman should. Robin was standing at her window already dressed in the short skirt and soft hat. She turned and showed that her thin small face was radiant. "I have been out on the moor. I wakened just after sunrise and I heard a skylark singing high up in the sky. I went out to listen and say my prayers," she said. "You don't know what the moor is like, Dowie, until you stand out on it at sunrise." She met Dowie's approach half way and slipped her arms round her neck and kissed her several times. Dowie had for a moment quailed before a thought that she looked too much like a young angel, but her arms held her close and her kisses were warm and human. "Well, well!" Dowie's pats on her shoulder took courage. "That's a good sign to get up and dress yourself and go into the open air. It would give you an appetite if anything would." "Perhaps I can eat 2 eggs this morning," with a pretty laugh. "Wouldn't that be wonderful?" And she took off her hat and laid it aside on the lounge as if she meant to go out again soon. Dowie tried not to watch her too obviously, but she could scarcely keep her eyes from her. She knew that she must not ask her questions at the risk of losing an advantage. She had, in fact, never been one of the women who must ask questions. There was, however, something eerie in remembering her queer feeling about the crying of the wind, silly though she had decided it to be, and something which made it difficult to go about all day knowing nothing but seeing strange signs. She had been more afraid for Robin than she would have admitted even to herself. And when the girls sat down at the table by the window overlooking the moor and ate her breakfast without effort or distaste, it was far from easy to look quite as if she had been doing it every morning. Then there was the look in her eyes, as if she was either listening to something or remembering it. She went out twice during the day and she carried it with her even when she talked of other things. Dowie saw it specially when she lay down on the big lounge to rest. But she did not lie down often or long at a time. It was as though she was no longer unnaturally tired and languid. She did little things for herself, moving about naturally, and she was pleased when a messenger brought flowers, explaining that his lordship had ordered that they should be sent every other day from the nearest town. She spent an hour filling crystal bowls and clear slim vases with them, and the look never left her. But she said nothing until she went out with Dowie at sunset. They only walked for a short time and they did not keep to the road, but went on the moor itself and walked among the heath and bracken. After a little while they sat down and gave themselves up to the vast silence, with here and there the last evening twitter of a bird in it. The note made the stillness greater. The flame of the sky was beyond compare, and after gazing at it for a while Dowie turned a slow furtive look on Robin. But Robin was looking at her with clear soft naturalness, loving and untroubled and kindly sweet. "He came back, Dowie. He came again," she said, and her voice was still as natural as the good woman had ever known it. Chapter XXVIII.
Chapter 28 of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. But even after this Dowie did not ask questions. She only watched more carefully and waited to be told what the depths of her being most yearned to hear. The gradually founded belief of her careful prosaic life prevented ease of mind or a sense of security. She could not be certain that it would be the part of wisdom to allow herself to feel secure. She did not wish to arouse Dr. Benton's professional anxiety by asking questions about Lady Maureen Darcy, but by a clever and adroitly gradual system of what was really cross-examination, which did not involve actual questions, she drew from him the name of the woman who had been Lady Maureen's chief nurse when the worst seemed impending. It was by fortunate chance the name of a woman she had once known well during a case of dangerous illness in an important household. She herself had had charge of the nursery, and Nurse Darien had liked her because she had proved prompt and intelligent in an alarming crisis. They had become friends, and Dowie knew she might write to her and ask for information and advice. She wrote a careful, respectful letter which revealed nothing but that she was anxious about a case which she had temporary charge of. She managed to have the letter posted in London and the answer forwarded to her from there. Nurse Darien's reply was generously full for a hard-working woman. It answered questions and was friendly. But the woman's war work had plainly led her to see and reflect upon the opening up of new and singular vistas. What we hear oftenest is that the whole world is somehow changing, she ended by saying. You hear it so often that you get tired. But something is happening. Something strange. Even the doctors find themselves facing things medical science does not explain. They don't like it. I sometimes think doctors hate change more than anybody. But the cleverest and biggest ones talk together. It's this looking at a thing lying on a bed alive and talking perhaps one minute and gone out the next that sets you asking yourself questions. In these days a nurse seems to see nothing else day and night. You can't make yourself believe they have gone far, and when you keep hearing stories about them coming back, knocking on tables, writing on queer boards, just anyway so that they can get at those they belong to, well, I shouldn't be sure of myself that a comforting dream means that a girl's mind's giving away. Of course a nurse is obliged to watch, but Lady Maureen found something, and she was going mad, and now she is as sane as I am. Dowie was vaguely supported because the woman was an intelligent person and knew her business thoroughly. Nevertheless, one must train one's eyes to observe everything without seeming to do so at all. Every morning when the weather was fine, Robin got up early and went out on the moor to say her prayers and listen to the skylark singing. When I stand and turn my face up to the sky and watch one going higher into heaven and singing all the time without stopping, she said, I feel as if the singing were carrying what I want to say with it. Sometimes he goes so high that you can't see him any more. He's not even a little speck in the highest sky. Then I think perhaps he has gone in and taken my prayer with him, but he always comes back. And perhaps if I could understand, he could tell me what the answer is. She ate her breakfast each day and was sweetly faithful to her promise to Dowie in every detail. Dowie used to think that she was like a child who wanted very much to learn her lesson well and follow every rule. I want to be good, Dowie, she said once. I should like to be very good. I am so grateful. Dr. Benton, driving up the moor road for his daily visits, made careful observation of every detail of her case and pondered in secret. The alarming thinness and sharpening of the delicate features was, he saw, actually becoming less marked day by day. The transparent hands were less transparent. The movements were no longer languid. She spends most of the day out of the doors when the weather's decent, Dowie said. She eats what I give her, and she sleeps. Dr. Benton asked many questions, and the answers given seemed to provide him with food for reflection.
"Has she spoken of having had that dream again?" he inquired at last. "Yes, sir," was Dowie's brief reply. "Did she say it was the same dream?" "She told me her husband had come back. She said nothing more." "Has she told you that more than once?" "No, sir. Only once so far." Dr. Benton looked at the sensible face very hard. He hesitated before he put his next question. "But you think she has seen him since she spoke to you? You feel that she might speak of it again at almost any time?" "She might, sir, and she might not. It may seem like a sacred thing to her, and it's no business of mine to ask her about things she'd perhaps rather not talk about." "Do you think that she believes that she sees her husband every night?" "I don't know what I think, sir," said Dowie in honourable distress. "Well, neither do I, for that matter," Benton answered brusquely. "Neither do thousands of other people who want to be honest with themselves. Physically the effect of this abnormal fancy is excellent. If this goes on she will end by being in a perfectly normal condition." "That's what I'm working for, sir," said Dowie. Whereupon Dr. Benton went away and thought still stranger and deeper things as he drove home over the moor road which twisted through the heather. The next day's post, delivered by Macaur himself, brought as it did weekly a package of books and carefully chosen periodicals. Robin had, before this, not been equal even to looking them over, and Dowie had arranged them neatly on shelves in the Tower room. To-day when the package was opened, Robin sat down near the table on which they were placed and began to look at them. Out of the corner of her eye, as she arranged books decorously on a shelf, Dowie saw the still transparent hand open first one book and then another. At last it paused at a delicately coloured pamphlet. It was the last alluring note of modern advertisement, sent out by a firm which made a specialty of children's outfits and belongings. It came from an elect and expensive shop which prided itself on its dainty presentation of small beings attired in entrancing garments, such as might have been designed for fairies and elves. "If she begins to turn over the pages she'll go on. It'll be just nature," Dowie yearned. The awakening she had thought nature would bring about was not like the perilous miracle she had seen take place, and had watched tremulously from hour to hour. Dreams, however much one had to thank God for them, were not exactly nature. They were not the blessed healing and strengthening she felt familiar with. You were never sure when they might melt away into space and leave only emptiness behind them. But if she would wake up the other way it would be healthy, just healthy, and to be depended upon, was her thought. Robin turned over the leaves in no hurried way. She had never carelessly turned over the leaves of her picture books in her nursery. As she had looked at her picture books she looked at this one. There were pages given to the tiniest and most exquisite things of all, and it was the illustrations of these Dowie's careful sidelong eye saw she had first been attracted by. "These are for very little ones?" she said presently. "Yes, for the new ones," answered Dowie. There was a moment or so of silence. "How little! How little!" Robin said softly. She rose softly and went to her couch and lay down on it. She was very quiet and Dowie wondered if she were thinking or if she were falling into a doze. She wished she had looked at the pamphlet longer. As the weeks had gone by, Dowie had even secretly grieved a little at her seeming unconsciousness of certain tender things. If she had only looked at it a little longer. Was there a sound of movement in the next room? The thought awakened Dowie in the night. She did not know what the hour was, but she was sure of the sound as soon as she was fully awake. Robin had got up and was crossing the corridor to the Tower room.
Does she want something? What could she want? I must go to her. She must never quite lose sight of her or let her be entirely out of hearing. Perhaps she was walking in her sleep. Perhaps the dream. Dowie was a little awed. Was he with her? In obedience to a weird impulse she always opened a window in the tower room every night before going to bed. She had left it open to night. It was still open when she entered the room herself. There was nothing unusual in the aspect of the place but that Robin was there and it was just midnight. She was not walking in her sleep. She was awake and standing by the table with the pamphlet in her hand. "I couldn't go to sleep," she said. "I kept thinking of the little things in this book. I kept seeing them." "That's quite natural," Dowie answered. "Sit down and look at them a bit. That'll satisfy you and you'll sleep easy enough. I must shut the window for you." She shut the window and moved a book or so as if such things were usually done at midnight. She went about in a quiet matter of fact way which was even gentler than her customary gentleness because in these days, while trying to preserve a quite ordinary demeanour, she felt as though she must move as one would move in making sure that one would not startle a bird one loved. Robin sat and looked at the pictures. When she turned a page and looked at it, she turned it again and looked at it with dwelling eyes. Presently she ceased turning pages and sat still with the book open on her lap, as if she were thinking not only of what she held, but of something else. When her eyes lifted to meet Dowie's, there was a troubled, wondering look in them. "It's so strange. I never seemed to think of it before." The words came slowly. "I forgot because I was always remembering." "You'll think now," Dowie answered. "It's only nature." "Yes, it's only nature." The touch of her hand on the pamphlet was a sort of caress. It was a touch which clung. "Dowie," timidly, "I want to begin to make some little clothes like these. Do you think I can?" "Well, my dear," answered Dowie composedly, no less so because it was past midnight and the stillness of the moor and deserted castle rooms was like a presence in itself. "I taught you to sew very neatly before you were 12. You liked to do it and you learned to make beautiful small stitches. And Mademoiselle taught you to do fine embroidery. She'd learned it in a convent herself and I never saw finer work anywhere." "I did like to do it," said Robin. "I never seemed to get tired of sitting in my little chair in the bay window where the flowers grew and making tiny stitches." "You had a gift for it. Not all girls have," said Dowie. "Sometimes when you were embroidering a flower you didn't want to leave it to take your walk." "I am glad I had a gift." Robin took her up. "You see I want to make these little things with my own hands. I don't want them sent up from London. I don't want them bought. Look at this, Dowie." Dowie went to her side. Her heart was quickening happily as it beat. Robin touched a design with her finger. "I should like to begin by making that," she suggested. "Do you think that if I bought one for a pattern I could copy it?" Dowie studied it with care. "Yes," she said. "You could copy it and make as many more as you liked. They need a good many." "I am glad of that," said Robin. "I should like to make a great many." Slim fingers slid over the page. "I should like to make that one and that and that." Her face, bent over the picture, wore its touching young look, thrilled with something new. "They are so pretty. They are so pretty," she murmured like a dove. "They're the prettiest things in the world," Dowie said. "There never was anything prettier." "It must be wonderful to make them and to know all the time you are putting in the tiny stitches
that they are for something little and warm and alive." "Those that have done it never forget it," said Dowie. Robin lifted her face, but her hand still held the book with the touch which clung. "I am beginning to realize what a strange life mine has been," she said. "Don't you think it has, Dowie? I haven't known things. I didn't know what mothers were. I never knew another child until I met Donal in the Gardens. No one had ever kissed me until he did. When I was older I didn't know anything about love and marrying, really. It seemed only something one read about in books until Donal came. You and Mademoiselle made me happy, but I was like a little nun." She paused a moment and then said thoughtfully, "Do you know, Dowie, I have never touched a baby?" "I never thought of it before," Dowie answered with a slightly caught breath. "But I believe you never have." The girl leaned forward and her own light breath came a shade more quickly, and the faint colour on her cheek flickered into a sweeter warm tone. "Are they very soft, Dowie?" she asked, and the asking was actually a wistful thing. "When you hold them do they feel very light and soft and warm? When you kiss them isn't it something like kissing a little flower?" "That's what it is," said Dowie firmly as one who knows. "A baby that's loved and taken care of is just nothing but fine soft lawns and white downiness with the scent of fresh violets under leaves in the rain." A vaguely dreamy smile touched Robin's face and she bent over the pictures again. "I felt as if they must be like that, though I never held one," she murmured. "And Donal told me." She did not say when he had told her, but Dowie knew. And unearthly as the thing was, regarded from her standpoint, she was not frightened, because she said mentally to herself what was happening was downright healthy and no harm could come of it. She felt safe and her mind was at ease even when Robin shut the little book and placed it on the table again. "I'll go to bed now," she said. "I shall sleep now." "To be sure you will," Dowie said, and they went out of the Tower room together, but before she followed her, Dowie slipped aside and quietly opened the window. Chapter XXIX.
Chapter 29 of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Coombe House had been transformed into one of the most practical nursing homes in London. The celebrated ballroom and picture gallery were filled with cots. A spacious bedroom had become a perfectly equipped operating room. Nurses and doctors moved everywhere with quiet swiftness. Things were said to be marvellously well done because Lord Coombe himself held reins which diplomatically guided and restrained amateurishness and emotional infelicities. He spent most of his time when he was in the house, in the room on the entrance floor where Mademoiselle had found him when she had come to him in her search for Robin. He had faced ghastly hours there as the war news struck its hideous variant note from day to day. Every sound which rolled through the street had its meaning for him, and there were few which were not terrible. They all meant inhuman struggle, inhuman suffering, inhuman passions, and wounds or death. He carried an unmoved face and a well-held head through the crowded thoroughfares. The men in the cots in his picture gallery and his ballroom were the better for the outward calm he brought when he sat and talked to them, but he often hid a mad fury in his breast or a heavy and sick fatigue. Even in London a man saw and heard and was able, if he had an imagination, to visualize too much to remain quite normal. He had seen what was left of strong men brought back from the front, men who could scarcely longer be counted as really living beings. He had talked to men on leave who had a hideous hardness in their haggard eyes and who did not know that they gnawed at their lips sometimes as they told things they had seen. He saw the people going into the churches and the chapels. He sometimes went into such places himself, and he always found there huddled forms kneeling in the pews, even when no service was being held. Sometimes they were men, sometimes women, and often they writhed and sobbed horribly. He did not know why he went in. His going seemed only part of some surging misery. He heard weird stories again and again of occult happenings. He had been told all the details of Lady Maureen's case and of a number of other cases somewhat resembling it. He was of those who have advanced through experience to the point where entire disbelief in anything is not easy. This was the more so because almost all previously accepted laws had been shaken as by an earthquake. He had fallen upon a new sort of book drifting about. He had had such books put into his hands by acquaintances, some of whom were of the impressionable hysteric order, but many of whom were as analytically minded as himself. He found much of such literature in the bookshops. He began to look over the best written and ended by reading them with deep attention. He was amazed to discover that for many years profoundly scientific men had been seriously investigating and experimenting with mysteries unexplainable by the accepted laws of material science. They had discussed, argued, and written grave books upon them. They had been doing all this before any Society for Psychical Research had founded itself, and the intention of new logic was to be scientific rather than psychological. They had written books, scattered through the years, on mesmerism, hypnosis, abnormal mental conditions, the powers of suggestion, even unexplored dimensions, and, in modern days, psychotherapeutics. What has amazed me is my own ignorance of the prolonged and serious nature of the investigation of an astonishing subject, he said in talking with the Duchess. To realise that analytical minds have been doing grave work of which one has known nothing is an actual shock to one's pride. I suppose the tendency would have been to pooh-pooh it. The cheap, modern popular form is often fantastic and crude, but there remains the fact that it all contains truths not to be explained by the rules we have always been familiar with. The Duchess had read the book he had brought her and held it in her hands. "Perhaps the time has come in which we are to learn the new ones," she said. "Perhaps we are being forced to learn them as a result of our pooh-poohing," was his answer. "Some of us may learn that clear-cut disbelief is at least indiscreet." Therefore, upon a certain morning he sat long in reflection over a letter which had arrived from Dowie. He read it a number of times. "I don't know what your lordship may think," Dowie said, and he felt she held herself with a tight rein. "If I may say so, it's what's going to come out of it that matters, and not what any of us think of it. So far it seems as if a miracle had happened. About a week ago she awakened in the morning looking as I'd been afraid she'd never look again. There was actually colour in her thin little face that almost made it look not so thin. There was a light in her eyes that quite startled me. She lay on her bed and smiled like a child that's suddenly put out of pain. She said, quite quiet and natural, that she'd seen her husband. She said he had come and talked to her a long time and that it was not a dream and he was not an angel, he was himself. At first I was terrified by a dreadful thought that her poor young mind had given way. But she had no fever and she was as sweet and sensible as if she was talking to her Dowie in her own nursery. And, my lord, this is what does matter, she sat up and ate her breakfast and said she would take a walk with me. And walk she did, stronger and better than I'd have believed. She had a cup of tea and a glass of milk and a fresh egg and a slice of hot buttered toast. That's what I hold on to, my lord, without any thinking. I daren't write about it at first because I didn't trust it to last. But she has wakened in the same way every morning since. And she's eaten the bits of nice meals I've put before her. I've been careful not to put her appetite off by giving her more than a little at a time. And she's slept like a baby and walked every day. I believe she thinks she sees Captain Muir every night. I wouldn't ask questions, but she spoke of it once again to me. Your obedient servant, Sarah Ann Dowson. Lord Coombe sat in interested reflection. He felt curiously uplifted above the rolling sounds in the street and the headlines of the pile of newspapers on the table. If it had not been for the tea and egg and buttered toast, she would have been sure the poor child was mad. He thought it out. An egg and a slice of buttered toast guarantee even spiritual things. Why not? We are material creatures who have only material sight and touch and taste to employ as arguments. I suppose that is why tables are tipped and banjos fly about for beginners. It's because we cannot see other things, and what we cannot see, oh, fools that we are! The child said he was not an angel, he was himself. Why not? Where did he come from? Personally, I believe that he came. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. It was Lord Coombe who sent the book, said Robin. She was sitting in the Tower room, watching Dowie open the packages which had come from London. She herself had opened the one which held the models, and she was holding a tiny film of lawn and fine embroidery in her hands. Dowie could see that she was quite unconscious that she loosely held it against her breast, as if she were nursing it. "It's his lordship's way to think of things." The discreet answer came impersonally. Robin looked slowly round the small and really quite wonderful room. "You know I said that the first night we came here." "Yes," Dowie answered. Robin turned her eyes upon her. They were no longer hollowed, but they still looked much too large. "Dowie," she said, "he knows things." "He always did," said Dowie. "Some do and some don't." "He knows things as Donal does. The secret things you can't talk about. The meaning of things." She went on as if she were remembering bit by bit. "When we were in the wood in the dark he said the first thing that made my mind begin to move almost to think. That was because he knew. Knowing things made him send the book." The fact was that he knew much of which it was not possible for him to speak, and in passing a shop window he had been fanatically arrested by a mere pair of small sleeves, the garment to which they belonged having by chance so fallen that they seemed to be tiny arms holding themselves out in surrendering appeal. They had held him a moment or so staring, and then he had gone into the shop and asked for their catalogue. "Yes, he knew," Dowie replied. A letter had been written to London, signed by Dowie, and the models and patterns had been sent to the village and brought to the castle by Jock Macaur. Later there had come rolls of fine flannel and lawn, with gossamer thread and fairy needles and embroidery floss. Then the sewing began. Dr. Benton had gradually begun to look forward to his daily visits with an interest stimulated by a curiosity become eager. The most casual looker on might have seen the change taking place in his patient day by day, and he was not a casual looker on. Was the improvement to be relied on? Would the mysterious support suddenly fail them? "What in God's name should we do if it did?" he broke out unconsciously aloud one day when Dowie and he were alone together. "If it did what, sir?" she asked. "If it stopped the dream." Dowie understood. By this time she knew that, when he asked questions, took notes and was professionally exact, he had ceased to think of Robin merely as a patient. She had touched him in some unusual way which had drawn him within the circle of her innocent woe. He was under the spell of her pathetic youngness which made Dowie herself feel as if they were watching over a child called upon to bear something it was unnatural for a child to endure. "It won't stop," she said obstinately, but she lost her ruddy colour because she was not sure. But after the sewing began there grew up within her a sort of courage. A girl whose material embodiment has melted away until she has worn the aspect of a wraith is not restored to normal bloom in a week. But what Dowie seemed to see was the lamp of life relighted and the first flickering flame strengthening to a glow. The hands which fitted together on the table in the Tower room delicate puzzles in bits of lawn and paper did not in these days tremble with weakness. Instead of the lost look there had returned to the young doe's eyes the pretty trusting smile. The girl seemed to smile as if to herself nearly all the time, Dowie thought, and often she broke into a happy laugh at her own small blunders, and sometimes only at the sweet littleness of things she was making. One fact revealed itself clearly to Dowie, which was that she had lost all sense of the aspect which the dream must wear to others than herself. This was because there had been no others than Dowie who had uttered no suggestion of doubt, and had never touched upon the subject unless it had been first broached by Robin herself. She had hidden her bewilderment and anxieties, and had outwardly accepted the girl's own acceptance of the situation. Of the incident of the sewing Lord Coombe had been informed later with other details. "She sits and sews," wrote Dowie. "She sewed beautifully even before she was out of the nursery. I have never seen a picture of a little saint sewing, but if I had, perhaps I should say she looked like it." Coombe read the letter to his old friend at Eaton Square. There was a pause as he refolded it. After the silence he added, as out of deep thinking, "I wish that I could see her." "So do I," the Duchess said. "So do I. But if I were to go to her, questioning would begin at once." "My going to Darreuch would attract no attention. It never did after the first year. But she has not said she wished to see me. I gave my word. I shall never see her again unless she asks me to come. She does not need me. She has Donal." "What do you believe?" she asked. "What do you believe?" he replied. And a moment of speculative gravity came to her reply. "As without proof I believe in the marriage, so without proof I believe that in some mysterious way he comes to her, God be thanked." "So do I," said Coombe. "We are living in a changing world and new things are happening. I do not know what they are, but they shake me inwardly." "You want to see her because " the Duchess put it to him. "Perhaps I am changing with the rest of the world. Or it may be that instincts which have always been part of me have been shaken to the surface of my being. Perhaps I was by nature an effusively affectionate and domestic creature. I cannot say that I have ever observed any signs of the tendency, but it may have lurked secretly within me." "It caused you to rescue a child from torment and watch over its helplessness as if it had been your own flesh and blood," interposed the Duchess. "It may have been. Who knows?
And now the unnatural emotional upheaval of the times has broken down all my artificialities. I feel old and tired, perhaps childish. Shrines are being torn down and blown to pieces all over the world. And I long for a quite simple shrine to cleanse my soul before. A white little soul hidden away in peace and sitting smiling over her sewing of small garments is worth making a pilgrimage to. Do you remember the childish purity of her eyelids? I want to see them drop down as she sews. I want to see her. Alexie and her children would have been your shrine. The Duchess thought it out slowly. Yes. He was the last of men to fall into an unconventional posture, but he dropped forward in his seat, his elbows on his knees, his forehead in his hands. If she lives, and the child lives, I shall long intolerably to see them. As her mother seemed to live in Alexie's exquisite body without its soul, so Alexie's soul seems to possess this child's body. Do I appear to be talking nonsense? Things without precedent have always been supposed to be nonsense. We are not so sure of that as we used to be, commented the Duchess. I shall long to be allowed to be near them, he added, but I may go out of existence without seeing them at all. I gave my word. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. After the first day of cutting out patterns from the models and finally sewing tiny pieces of lawn together, Dowie saw that, before going to her bedroom for the night, Robin began to gather together all she had done and used in doing her work. She had ordered from London one of the pretty silk-lined, lace-frilled baskets women are familiar with, and she neatly folded and laid her sewing in it. She touched each thing with fingers that lingered. She smoothed and once or twice patted something. She made exquisitely orderly little piles. Her down-dropped white lids quivered with joy as she did it. When she lifted them to look at Dowie, her eyes were like those of a stray young spirit. "I am going to take them into my room," she said. "I shall take them every night. I want to keep them on a chair quite near me so that I can put out my hand and touch them." "Yes, my lamb," Dowie agreed cheerfully, but she knew she was going to hear something else, and this would be the third time. "I want to show them to Donal." The very perfection of her naturalness gave Dowie a cold chill, even while she thanked God. She had shivered inwardly when she had opened the tower room window, and so she shivered now despite her serene exterior. A simple unexalted body could not but think of those fragments which were never even found. And she, standing there with her lips and eyes smiling, just like any other radiant girl mother whose young husband is her lover, enraptured and amazed by this new miracle of hers. Robin touched her with the tip of her finger. "It can't be only a dream, Dowie," she said. "He's too real. I am too real. We are too happy." She hesitated a second. "If he were here at Darreuch in the daytime, I should not always know where he had been when he was away. Only his coming back would matter. He can't tell me now just where he comes from. He says 'not yet,' but he comes every night, Dowie." Every day she sewed in the tower room, her white eyelids drooping over her work. Each night the basket was carried to her room, and each day Dowie watched with amazement the hollows in her temples and cheeks and under her eyes fill out, the small bones cover themselves, the thin throat grow round with young tissue and smooth with satin skin.
Her hair became light curled silk again. The faint colour deepened into the Jacqueminot glow at which passers by had turned to look in the street when she was little more than a baby. But she never talked of the dream. The third time was the last for many weeks. Between Dr. Benton and Dowie there grew up an increased reserve concerning the dream. Never before had the man encountered an experience which so absorbed him. He was a student of the advanced order. He also had seen the books which had fallen into the hands of Coombe, some of the work of scientific men, some the purely commercial outcome of the need of the hour, written by the jackals of the literary profession. He would have been ready to sit by the bedside of his patient through the night, watching over her sleep, holding her wrist with fingers on her pulse. Even his most advanced thinking involuntarily harked back to pulse and temperature and blood pressure. The rapidity of the change taking place in the girl was abnormal, but it expressed itself physically as well as mentally. How closely involved physiology and psychology were after all! Which was which? Where did one end and the other begin? Where was the line drawn? Was there a line at all? He had seen no chances for the apparently almost dying young thing when he had first met her. She could not have lived through what lay before her. She had had a dream which she believed was real, and through the pure joy and comfort of it, the life forces had begun to flow through her being and combine to build actual firm tissue and supply blood cells. The results were physical enough. The inexplicable in this case was that the curative agency was that she believed that her husband, who had been blown to atoms on the battlefield, came to her alive each night, talked with her, held her in warm arms. Nothing else had aided her. And there you were, thrown upon occultism and what not. He became conscious that, though he would have been glad to question Dowie daily and closely, a certain reluctance of mind held him back. Also he realized that, being a primitive though excellent woman, Dowie herself was secretly awed into avoidance of the subject. He believed that she knelt by her bedside each night in actual fear, but faithfully praying that for some months at least the dream might be allowed to go on. Had not he himself involuntarily said, "She is marvellously well. We have nothing to fear if this continues." It did continue, and her bloom became a thing to marvel at. And not her bloom alone. Her strength increased with her blooming, until no one could have felt fear for or doubt of her. She walked upon the moor without fatigue. She even worked in a garden Jock Macaur had laid out for her inside the ruined walls of what had once been the castle's banquet hall. So much of her life had been spent in London that wild moor and sky and the growing of things thrilled her. She ran in and out and to and fro like a little girl. There seemed no limit to the young vigour that appeared, day by day, to increase rather than diminish. "It's a wonderful thing and God be thankit," said Mrs. Macaur. Only Dowie in secret trembled sometimes before the marvel of her. As Dr. Benton had imagined, she prayed forcefully. "Lord, forgive me if I am a sinner, but for Christ's sake don't take the strange thing away from her until she's got something to hold on to. What would she do? What could she?" Robin came into the Tower room on a fair morning carrying her pretty basket as she always did. She put it down on its table and went and stood a few minutes at a window looking out. The back of her neck, Dowie realized, was now as slenderly round and velvet white as it had been when she had dressed her hair on the night of the Duchess's dance. Dowie did not know that its loveliness had been poor George's temporary undoing. She only thought of it as a sign of the wonderful change. It had been waxen pallid and had shown piteous hollows. She turned about and spoke. "Dowie, dear, I am going to write to Lord Coombe."
Dowie's heart hastened its beat, and she herself, being conscious of the fact, hastened to answer in an unexcited manner. "That'll be nice, my dear. His lordship'll be glad to get the good news you can give him." She asked herself if she would not perhaps tell her something which would make the fourth time. Perhaps he'd asked her to do it, she thought. But Robin said nothing which could make a fourth time. After she had eaten her breakfast, she sat down and wrote a letter. It did not seem a long one, and when she had finished it, she sent it to the post by Jock Macaur. There had been dark news both by land and sea that day, and Coombe had been out for many hours. He did not return to Coombe House until late in the evening. He was tired almost beyond endurance, and his fatigue was not merely a thing of muscle and nerve. After he sat down, it was some time before he even glanced at the letters upon his writing table. There were always a great many, and usually a number of them were addressed in feminine handwriting. His hospital and other war work brought him numerous letters from women. Even their most impatient masculine opponents found themselves admitting that the women were being amazing. Coombe was so accustomed to opening such letters that he felt no surprise when he took up an envelope without official lettering upon it and addressed in a girlish hand. Girls were being as amazing as older women. But this was not a letter about war work or Red Cross efforts. It was Robin's letter. It was not long and was as simple as a schoolgirl's. She had never been clever, only exquisite and adorable, and never dull or stupid. "Dear Lord Coombe, you were kind enough to say that you would come to see me when I asked you. Please, will you come now? I hope I am not asking you to take a long journey when you are engaged in work too important to leave. If I am, please pardon me, and I will wait until you are less occupied. Robin." That was all. Coombe sat and gazed at it and read it several times. The thing which had always touched him most in her was her simple obedience to the laws about her. Curiously, it had never seemed insipid, only a sort of lovely desire to be in harmony with all near her, things and people alike. It had been an innocent modesty which could not express rebellion. Her lifelong repelling of himself had been her one variation from type. Even that had been quiet, except in one demonstration of her babyhood when she had obstinately refused to give him her hand. When Fate's self had sprung upon her with a wild beast leap, she had only lain still and panted like a young fawn in the clutch of a lion. She had only thought of Donal and his child. He remembered the eyes she had lifted to his own when he had put the ring on her finger in the shadow-filled old church, and he had understood that she was thinking of the warm young hand-clasp and the glow of eyes she had looked up into when love and youth had stood in his place. The phrasing of the letter brought it all back. His precision of mind and resolve would have enabled him to go to his grave without having looked on her face again, but he was conscious that she was an integral part of his daily thought and planning, and that he longed inexpressibly to see her. He sometimes told himself that she and the child had become a sort of obsession with him. He believed that this was because Elixie had shown the same soft obedience to fate and the same look in her sorrowful young eyes. Elixie had been then as she was now, but he had not been able to save her. She had died, and he was one of the few abnormal male creatures who know utter loneliness to the end of life because of utter loss. He knew such things were not normal. It had seemed that Robin would die, though not as Elixie did. If she lived and he might watch over her, there lay hidden in the back of his mind a vague feeling that it would be rather as though his care of all detail, his power to palliate, to guard, would be near the semblance of the tenderness he would have shown to Elixie. His old habit of mind caused him to call it an obsession,
but he admitted he was obsessed. "I want to see her," he thought. Chapter 32 of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 32. Many other thoughts filled his mind on his railroad journey to Scotland. He questioned himself as to how deeply he still felt the importance of their coming into the racked world ahead of the House of Coombe, how strongly he was still inspired by the centuries-old instinct that a House of Coombe must continue to exist as part of the bulwarks of England. The ancient instinct still had its power, but he was curiously awakening to a slackening of the bonds which caused a man to specialise. It was a reluctant awakening. He himself had no part in the slackening. The upheaval of the whole world had done it, and of the world England herself was a huge part, small, huge, obstinate, fighting England. Bereft of her old stately beauties, her picturesque splendours of habit and custom, he could not see a vision of her, and owned himself desolate and homesick. He was tired. So many men and women were tired, worn out with thinking, fearing, holding their heads up while their hearts were lead. When all was said and done, when all was over, what would the new England want? What would she need? And England was only a part. What would the ravaged world need as it lay, quiet at last, in ruins physical, moral, and mental? He had no answer. Wiser men than he had no answer. Only time would tell. But the commonest brain cells in the thickest skull could argue the end which proved that only men and women could do the work to be done. The task would be one for gods, or demigods, or supermen, but there remained so far only men and women to face it, to rebuild, to re-inspire with life, to heal unearthly gaping wounds of mind and soul. Each man or woman born strong and given the chance to increase in vigour which would build belief in life and living, in a future, was needed as breath and air are needed, even such as one as in the past would have wielded a sort of unearned sceptre as head of the House of Coombe. A man born a blacksmith, if he were of like quality, would meet equally the world's needs, but each would be doing in his way his part of that work which it seemed to day only demigod and superman could fairly confront. There was time for much thinking in long hours spent shut in a railway carriage, and his mind was, in these days, not given to letting him rest. He had talked with many men back from the front on leave, and he had always noted the marvel of both minds and bodies at the relief from strain, from maddening noise, from sights of death and horror, from the needs of decency and common comfort and cleanliness, which had become unheard of luxury. London, which to the Londoner seemed caught in the tumult and turmoil of war, was to these men rest and peace. Coombe felt, when he descended at the small isolated station and stood looking at the climbing moor, that he was like one of those who had left the roar of battle behind and reached utter quiet. London was a world's width away, and here the war did not exist. In Flanders and in France it filled the skies with thunders and drenched the soil with blood, but here it was not. The partly rebuilt ruin of Darreuch rose at last before his view high on the moor as he drove up the winding road. The space and the blue sky above and behind it made it seem the embodiment of remote stillness.
Nothing had reached nor could touch it. It did not know that green fields and deep woods were strewn with dead and mangled youth and all it had meant of the world's future. Its crumbled walls and remaining grey towers stood calm in the clear air, and birds' nests were hidden safely in their thick ivy. Robin was there, and each night she believed that a dead man came to her, a seeming living being. He was not like Dowie, but his realisation of the mystery of this thing touched his nerves as a wild, unexplainable sound heard in the darkness at midnight might have done. He wondered if he should see some look which was not quite normal in her eyes, and hear some unearthly note in her voice. Physically the effect upon her had been good, but might he not be aware of the presence of some mental sign? "I think you'll be amazed when you see her, my lord," said Dowie, who met him. "I am myself every day." She led him up to the Tower room, and when he entered it Robin was sitting by a window sewing with her eyelids dropped as he had pictured them. The truth was that Dowie had not previously announced him because she had wanted him to come upon just this. Robin rose from her chair and laid her bit of sewing aside. For a moment he almost expected her to make the little curtsy Mademoiselle had taught her to make when older people came into the schoolroom. She looked so exactly as she had looked before life had touched her. There was very little change in her girlish figure. The child curve of her cheek had returned. The Jacqueminot rose glowed on it, and her eyes were liquid wonders of trust. She came to him, holding out both hands. "Thank you for coming," she said in her pretty way. "Thank you, Lord Coombe, for coming." "Thank you, my child, for asking me to come," he answered, and he feared that his voice was not wholly steady. There was no mystic sign to be seen about her. The only mystery was in her absolutely blooming health and naturalness, and in the gentle and clear happiness of her voice and eyes. She was not tired. She was not dragged or anxious looking, as he had seen even fortunate young wives and mothers at times. There actually flashed back upon him the morning, months ago, when he had met her in the street and said to himself that she was like a lovely child on her birthday with all her gifts about her. Her radiance had been quiet even then because she was always quiet. She led him to a seat near her window and she sat by him. "I put this chair here for you because it is so lovely to look out at the moor," she said. That moved him to begin with. She had been thinking simply and kindly of him even before he came. He had always been prepared for, waited upon either with flattering attentions or ceremonial service, but the quiet pretty things mothers and sisters and wives did had not been part of his life, and he had always noticed and liked them and sometimes wondered that most men received them with a casual air. This small thing alone caused the roar he had left behind to recede still farther. "I was afraid that you might be too busy to come," she went on. "You see, I remembered how important the work was, and that there are things which cannot wait for an hour. I could have waited as long as you told me to wait, but I am so glad you could come." "I will always come," was his answer. "I have helped others who could be wholly trusted if I died to-night. I have thought of that. One must." She hesitated a moment and then said, "I am quite away here as you wanted me to be. I see it was the only thing. I read nothing, hear nothing. London the war." Her voice fell a little. "They go on. Will you be kind to me and help me to forget them for a while?" He looked through the window at the sky and the moor. "They are not here. They never have been. The men who come back will do anything to make themselves forget for a little while. This place makes me feel that I am a man who has come back." "I will do anything everything you wish me to do," she said eagerly. "Dowie wondered if you would not want to be very quiet and not be reminded. I wondered too." "You were both right. I want to feel that I am in another world. This seems like a new planet." "Would you?" she spoke rather shyly. "Would you be able to stay a few days?" "I can stay a week," he answered. "Thank you, Robin." "I am so glad," she said. "I am so glad." So they did not talk about the War or about London, though she inquired about the Duchess and Lady Lothwell and Kathryn. "Would you like to go out and walk over the moor?" she asked after a short time. "It's so scented and sweet, and darling things scurry about. I don't think they are really frightened, because I try to walk softly. Sometimes there are nests with eggs or soft little things in them." They went out together and walked side by side, sometimes on the winding road and sometimes through the heather. He found himself watching every step she made and keeping his eye on the path ahead of them to make sure she would avoid roughness or irregularities. In some inner part of his being there remotely worked the thought that this was the way in which he might have walked side by side with Elixie, watching over each step taken by her sacred little feet. The day was a wonder of peace and relaxation to him. Farther and farther, until lost in nothingness, receded the roar and the tensely strung sense of waiting for news of unbearable things. As they went on he realised that he need not even watch the path before her because she knew it so well and her step was as light and firm as a young rose. Her very movements seemed to express the natural physical enjoyment of exercise. He knew nothing of her mind but that Mademoiselle had told him that she was intelligent. They had never talked together and so her mentality was an unexplored field to him. She did not chatter. She said fresh picturesque things about life on the moor, about the faithful silent Macaurs, about Dowie, and now and then about something she had read. She showed him beauties and small curious things she plainly loved. It struck him that the whole trend of her being lay in the direction of being fond of people and of things, of loving and being happy, and even merry if life had been kind to her. Her soft laugh had a naturally merry note. He heard it first when she held him quite still at her side as they watched the frisking of some baby rabbits. There was a curious relief in realising, as the hours passed, that her old dislike and dread of him had melted into nothingness, like a mist blown away in the night. She was thinking of him as if he were some mature and wise friend who had always been kind to her. He need not rigidly watch his words and hers. She was not afraid of him at all. There was no shrinking in her eyes when they met his. If Elixie had had a daughter who was his own, she might have lifted such lovely eyes to him. They lunched together, and Dowie served them with deft ability and an expression which Coombe was able to comprehend the at once watchful and directing meaning of. It directed him to observation of Robin's appetite and watched for his encouraged realisation of it as a supporting fact. He went to his own rooms in the afternoon that she might be alone and rest. He read an old book for an hour and then talked with the Macaurs about the place and their work and their new charge. He wanted to hear what they were thinking of her. "It's wonderful, my lord," was Mrs. Macaur's repeated contribution. "She came here a wee ghost. She frightened me. I couldna see how she could go through what's before her. I lay awake in my bed expectin' Mrs. Dowie to call me any hour. And betwixt one night and anither the change cam.
She's a well bairn. For a woman she isna, poor wee thing. It's a wonder a wonder a wonder, my lord." When he saw Dowie alone he asked her a question. "Does she know that you have told me of the dream?" "No, my lord. The dream's a thing we don't talk about. She's only mentioned it 3 times. It's in my mind that she feels it's too sacred to be made common by words." He had wondered if Robin had been aware of his knowledge. After Dowie's answer he wondered if she would speak to him about the dream herself. Perhaps she would not. It might be that she had asked him to come to Darreuch because her thought of him had so changed that she had realised something of his grave anxiety for her health, and a gentle consideration had made her wish to give him the opportunity to see her face to face. Perhaps she had intended only this. "I want to see her," he had said to himself. The relief of the mere seeing had been curiously great. He had the relief of sinking, as it were, into the deep waters of pure peace on this new planet. In this realisation every look at the child's face, every movement she made, every tone of her voice aided. Did she know that she soothed him? Did she intend to try to soothe? When they were together she gave him a feeling that she was strangely near and soft and warm. He had felt it on the moor. It was actually as if she wanted to be quieting to him, almost as if she had realised that he had been stretched upon a mental rack with maddening tumult all around him. It was part of her pretty thought of him in the matter of the waiting chair, and he felt it very sweet. But she had had other things in her mind when she had asked him to come. This he knew later. Chapter XXXIII of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XXXIII. After they had dined, they sat together in the long Highland twilight before her window in the Tower room, where he had found her sitting when he arrived. Her work basket was near her, and she took a piece of sheer lawn from it and began to embroider, and he sat and watched her draw delicate threads through the tiny leaves and flowers she was making. So he might have watched Elixie if she had been some unroyal girl given to him in one of life's kinder hours. She seemed to draw near out of the land of lost shadows as he sat in the clear twilight stillness and looked on, as he might have watched Elixie. The silence, paling daffodil tints of the sky, the non-existence of any other things than calm and stillness, seemed to fill his whole being as a cup might be filled by pure water falling slowly. She said nothing and did not even seem to be waiting for anything. It was he who first broke the rather long silence, and his voice was quite low. "Do you know you are very good to me?" he said. "How did you learn to be so kind to a man with your quietness?" He saw the hand holding her work tremble a very little. She let it fall upon her knee, still holding the embroidery. She leaned forward slightly, and in her look there was actually something rather like a sort of timid prayer. "Please let me," she said. "Please let me, if you can." "Let you," was all that he could say. "Let me try to help you to rest. To feel quiet and forget for just a little while. It's such a small thing, and it's all I can ever try to do." "You do it very perfectly," he answered, touched and wondering. "You have been kind to me ever since I was a child, and I did not know," she said. "Now I know, because I understand. Oh, will you forgive me? Please, will you?" "Don't, my dear," he said. You were a baby. I understood. That prevented there being anything to forgive. Anything."
"I ought to have loved you as I loved Mademoiselle and Dowie." Her eyes filled with tears. "And I think I hated you. It began with Donal," in a soft wail. "I heard Andrews say that his mother wouldn't let him know me because you were my mother's friend. And then as I grew older "
"Even if I had known what you thought, I could not have defended myself," he answered, faintly smiling. "You must not let yourself think of it. It is nothing now."
The hand holding the embroidery lifted itself to touch her breast. There was even a shade of awe of him in her eyes. "It is something to me and to Donal. You have never defended yourself. You endure things and endure them. You watched for years over an ignorant child who loathed you. It was not that a child's hatred is of importance. But if I had died and never asked you to forgive me, how could I have looked into Donal's eyes? I want to go down on my knees to you." He rose from his chair and took in his own the unsteady hand holding the embroidery. He even bent and lightly touched it with his lips with his finished air. "You will not die," he said, "and you will not go upon your knees. Thank you for being a warm hearted child, Robin." But still her eyes held the touch of awe of him. "But what I have spoken of is the least." Her voice almost broke. "In the wood in the dark you said there was something that must be saved from suffering. I could not think then. I could scarcely care. But you cared and you made me come awake. To save a poor little child who was not born, you have done something which will make people believe you were vicious and hideous. Even when all this is over for ever and ever, and there will be no one to defend you. Oh, what shall I do?"
"There are myriads of worlds," was his answer, "and this is only one of them. And I am only one man among the myriads on it.
Let us be very quiet again and watch the coming out of the stars." In the pale saffron of the sky which was mysteriously darkening, sparks like deep set brilliants were lighting themselves here and there. They sat and watched them together for long. But first Robin murmured something barely above her lowest breath. Coombe was not sure that she expected him to hear it. "I want to be your little slave. Oh, let me." Chapter XXXIV. This was what she had been thinking of. This had been the meaning of the tender thought for him he had recognised uncomprehendingly in her look. It had been the cause of her desire to enfold him in healing and restful peace. When he had felt that she drew so close to him that they were scarcely separated by physical being, it was because she had suddenly awakened to a new comprehension. The awakening must have been a sudden one. He had known at the church that it had taken all her last remnant of strength to aid her to lay her cold hand in his, and he had seen shrinking terror in her eyes when she lifted them to his as he put on her wedding ring. He had also known perfectly what memory had beset her at the moment, and he had thrown all the force of his will into the look which had answered her, the look which had told her that he understood. Yes, the awakening must have been sudden, and he asked himself how it had come about. What had made it all clear? He had never been a mystic, but during the cataclysmic hours through which men were living, many of them stunned into half blindness and then shocked into an unearthly clarity of thought and sight, he had come upon previously unheard of signs of mysticism on all sides. People talked, most of them blunderingly,
of things they would not have mentioned without derision in pre-war days. Premonitions, dreams, visions, telepathy were not by any means always flouted with raucous laughter and crude witticisms. Even unorthodox people had begun to hold tentatively religious views. Was he becoming a mystic at last? As he walked by Robin's side on the moor, as he dined with her, talked with her, sat and watched her at her sewing, more than ever each hour he believed that her dream was no ordinary fantasy of the unguided brain. She had in some strange way seen Donal. Where? How? Where he had come from, where he returned after their meeting, he ceased to ask himself. What did it matter, after all, if souls could so comfort and sustain each other? The blessedness of it was enough. He wondered, as Dowie had done, whether she would reveal anything to him or remain silent. There was no actual reason why she should speak. No remotest reference to the subject would come from himself. It was, in truth, a new planet he lived on during this marvel of a week. The child was wonderful, he told himself. He had not realised that a feminine creature could be so exquisitely enfolding and yet leave a man so wholly free. She was not always with him, but her spirit was so near that he began to feel that no faintest wish could form itself within his mind without her mysteriously knowing of its existence and realising it while she seemed to make no effort. She did pretty things for him, and her gladness in his pleasure in them touched him to the core. He also knew that she wished him to see that she was well and strong and never tired or languid. There was perhaps one thing she could do for him, and she wanted to prove to him that he might be sure she would not fail him. He allowed her to perform small services for him because of the dearness of the smile it brought to her lips, almost a sort of mothering smile. It was really true that she wanted to be his little slave, and he had imagination enough to guess that she comforted herself by saying the thing to herself again and again, childlike and fantastic as it was. She taught him to sleep as he had not slept for a year. She gave him back the power to look at his food without a sense of being repelled. She restored to him the ability to sit still in a chair as though it were meant to rest in. His nerves relaxed, his deadly fatigue left him, and it was the quiet nearness of Robin that had done it. He felt younger and knew that on his return to London he should be more inclined to disbelieve exaggerated rumours than to believe them. On the evening before he left Darreuch they sat at the Tower window again. She did not take her sewing from its basket, but sat very quietly for a while, looking at the purple folds of the moor. "You will go away very early in the morning," she began at last. "Yes. You must promise me that you will not awaken." "I do not waken early. But if I do I shall come to you. But I think I shall be asleep." "Try to be asleep." He saw that she was going to say something else, something not connected with his departure. It was growing in her eyes, and after a silent moment or so she began. "There is something I want to tell you," she said. "Yes." "I have waited because I wanted to make sure that you could believe it. I did not think you would not wish to believe it, but sometimes there are people who cannot believe, even when they try. Perhaps once I should not have been able to believe myself. But now I know. And to night I feel that you are one of those who can believe." She was going to speak of it. "In these days when all the forces of the world are in upheaval, people are learning that there are many new things to be believed. was his answer. She turned towards him, extending her arms that he might see her well. "See," she said, "I am alive again. I am alive because Donal came back to me. He comes every night, and when he comes he is not dead. Can you believe it?" "When I look at you and remember, I can believe anything. I do not understand. I do not know where he comes from or how, but I believe that in some way you see him." She had always been a natural and simple girl and it struck him that her manner had never been a more natural one. "I do not know where he comes from," the clearness of a bell in her voice. "He does not want me to ask him. He did not say so, but I know. When he is with me we know things without speaking words. We only talk of happy things. I have not told him that I had been unhappy and that I thought that perhaps I was really dead. He made me understand about you. But he does not know anything else. Yes," eagerly, eagerly, "you are believing you are." "Yes, I am believing." "If everything were as it used to be, I should see him and talk to him in the daytime. Now I see him and talk to him at night instead. You see, it is almost the same thing. But we are really happier. We are afraid of nothing and we will only tell each other of happy things. We know how wonderful everything is and that it was meant to be like that. You don't know how beautiful it is when you only think and talk about joyful things. The other things fly away. Sometimes we go out onto the moor together and the darkness is not darkness. It is a soft, lovely thing as beautiful as the light. We love it. And we can go as far as we like because we are never tired. Being tired is one of the things that has flown away and left us quite light. That is why I feel light in the day and I am never tired or afraid. I remember all the day." As he listened, keeping his eyes on her serenely radiant face, he asked himself what he should have been thinking if he had been a psychopathic specialist studying her case. He at the same time realised that a psychopathic specialist's opinion of what he himself, Lord Coombe, thought would doubtless have been scientifically disconcerting. For what he found that he thought was that, through some mysteriously beneficent opening of portals kept closed through all the eons of time, she, who was purest love's self, had strangely passed to places where vision revealed things as they were created by that first intention, of which people sometimes glibly talked in London drawing rooms. He had not seen life so. He was not on her plane, but, as he heard her, he for the time believed in its existence and felt a remote nostalgia. "Dowie is very brave and tries not to be frightened," she went on, "but she is really afraid that something may happen to my mind. She thinks it is only a queer dream which may turn out unhealthy. But it is not. It is Donal." "Yes, it is Donal," he answered gravely. And he believed he was speaking a truth, though he was aware of no material process of reasoning by which such a conclusion could be reached. One had to overleap gaps, even abysses, where material reasoning came to a full stop. One could only argue that there might be yet unknown processes to be revealed. Mere earthly invention was revealing on this plane unknown processes year by year, why not on other planes? "I wanted to tell you because I want you to know everything about me. It seems as if I belonged to you, Lord Coombe." There was actual sweet pleading in her voice. "You watched and made my life for me. I should not have been this Robin if you had not watched. When Donal came back he found me in the house you had taken me to because I could be safe in it. Everything has come from you. I am yours as well as Donal's." "You give me extraordinary comfort, dear child," he said. "I did not know that I needed it, but I see that I did. Perhaps I have longed for it without knowing it. You have opened closed doors."
"I will do anything everything you wish me to do. I will obey you always," she said.
"You are doing everything I most desire," he answered.
"Then I will try more every day." She meant it as she had always meant everything she said. It was her innocent pledge of faithful service, because, understanding at last, she had laid her white young heart in gratitude at his feet. No living man could have read her more clearly than this one whom half Europe had secretly smiled at as its most finished debauchee. When she took her pretty basket upon her knee and began to fold its bits of lawn delicately for the night, he felt as if he were watching some stainless acolyte laying away the fine cloths of an altar. Though no one would have accused him of being a sentimentalist or an emotional man, his emotions overpowered him for once and swept doubt of emotion and truth into some outer world. The morning rose fair and the soft wind blowing across the gorse and heather brought scents with it. Dowie waited upon him at his early breakfast and took the liberty of indulging in open speech. "You go away looking rested, my lord," she respectfully ventured, "and you leave us feeling safe." "Quite safe," he answered. "She is beautifully well." "That's it, my lord, beautifully, thank God. I've never seen a young thing bloom as she does, and I've seen many." The cart was at the door and he stood in the shadows of the hall when a slight sound made him look up the staircase. It was an ancient winding stone descent with its feudal hand rope for balustrade. Robin was coming down it in a loose white dress. Her morning face was wonderful. It was inevitable that he should ask himself where she had come from, what she had brought with her unknowing. She looked like a white blossom drifting from the bough, like a feather from a dove's wing floating downward to earth. But she was only Robin. "You awakened," he reproached her. She came quite near him. "I wanted to awake. Donal wanted me to." She had never been quite so near him before. She put out a hand and laid it on the rough tweed covering his breast. "I wanted to see you. Will you come again when you are tired? I shall always be here waiting." "Thank you, dear child," he answered. "I will come as often as I can leave London. This is a new planet." He was almost as afraid to move as if a bird had alighted near him. But she was not afraid. Her eyes were clear pools of pure light. "Before you go away," she said as simply as she had said it to Dowie years before, "may I kiss you, Lord Coombe? I want to kiss you." His old friend had told him the story of Dowie and it had extraordinarily touched him, though he had said but little. And now it repeated itself. He had never seen anything so movingly lovely in his life as her sweet gravity. She lifted her slight arms and laid them around his neck as she kissed him gently as if she had been his daughter, his own daughter and delight, whose mother might have been Alixe. Chapter XXXV of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XXXV. It was the strangest experience of my existence. It seemed suddenly to change me to another type of man." He said it to the Duchess as he sat with her in her private room at Eaton Square. He had told her the whole story of his week at Darreuch, and she had listened with an interest at moments almost breathless. "Do you feel that you shall remain the new type of man? Or was it only a temporary phase?" she inquired. I told her that I felt I was living on a new planet. London is the old planet and I have returned to it, but not as I left it. Something has come back with me. "It must have seemed another planet," the Duchess pondered. "The stillness of huge unbroken moors, no war, no khaki in sight, utter peace and remoteness. A girl brought back to life by pure love, drawing a spirit out of the unknown to her side on earth. She is like a spirit herself, but that she remains Robin in an extraordinary new blooming." "Yes, she remains Robin." The Duchess thought it out slowly. "Not once did she disturb you or herself by remembering that you were her husband. A girl who existed on the old planet would have remembered, and I should have detested her. To her, marriage means only Donal. The form we went through she sees only as a supreme sacrifice I made for the sake of Donal's child. If you could have heard her heart wrung cry, 'There will be no one to defend you. Oh, what shall I do?'" "The stainless little soul of her!" the Duchess exclaimed. "Her world holds only love and tenderness. Her good bye to you meant that in her penitence she wanted to take you into it in the one way she feels most sacred. She will not die. She will live to give you the child. If it is a son, there will be a head of the House of Coombe. On the new planet one ceases to feel the vital importance of houses," Coombe half reflected aloud. "Even on the old planet," the Duchess spoke as a woman very tired, "one is beginning to contemplate changes in values. The slice of a house in Mayfair had never within the memory of man been so brilliant. The things done in it were called war work and necessitated much active gaiety. Persons of both sexes, the majority of them in becoming uniform, flashed in and out in high spirits. If you were a personable and feminine creature, it was necessary to look as much like an attractive boy as possible when you were doing war work. If one could achieve something like leggings, in addition to a masculine cut of coat, one could swagger about most alluringly. There were numbers of things to be done which did not involve frumpish utilitarian costumes, all caps and aprons. Very short skirts were the most utilitarian of garments, because they were easy to get about in. Smart military little hats were utilitarian also, and could be worn at any inspiring angle which would most attract the passing eye. Even before the war, shapely legs, feet, and ankles had begun to play an increasingly interesting part in the scheme of the universe, as a result of the brevity of skirts and the prevalence of cabaret dancing. During the war, as a consequence of the war work done in such centres of activity as the slice of a house in Mayfair, these attractive members were allowed opportunities such as the world had not before contemplated. "Skirts must be short when people are doing real work," Feather said. "And then of course one's shoes and stockings require attention. I'm not always sure I like leggings, however smart they are. Still, I often wear them as a sort of example." "Of what?" inquired Coombe, who was present. "Oh, well, of what women are willing to do for their country in time of war, wearing unbecoming things and doing without proper food. These food restrictions are enough to cause a revolution." She was specially bitter against the food restrictions. If there was one thing men back from the front, particularly officers, were entitled to, it was unlimited food. The government ought to attend to it. When a man came back and you invited him to dinner, a nice patriotic thing it was to restrict the number of courses and actually deny him savouries and entrees because they are called luxuries. Who should have luxuries if not the men who were defending England? "Of course the Tommies don't need them," she leniently added. "They never had them and never will. Men who are officers in smart regiments are starving for them. I consider that my best war work is giving as many dinner parties as possible and paying as little attention to food restrictions as I can manage by using my wits." For some time, in certain quarters, even from early days, there had been flowing through many places a current of talk about America. What was she going to do? Was she going to do anything at all? Would it be possible for her hugeness, her power, her wealth, to remain inert in a world crisis? Would she be content tacitly to admit the truth of old accusations of commerciality, by securing as her part in the superhuman conflict the simple and unadorned making of money through the dire necessities of the world? There was bitterness, there were sneers, there were vague hopes and scathing injustices born of torment and racking dread. Some few were patiently just, because they knew something of the country and its political and social workings, and were by chance of those whose points of view included the powers and significances of things not readily to be seen upon the surface of events. "If there were dollars to be made out of it, of course America would rush in," was Feather's decision. "Americans never do anything unless they can make dollars. I never saw a dollar myself, but I believe they are made of green paper. It would be very exciting if they did rush in. They would bring so much money and they spend it as if it were water. Of course they haven't any proper army, so they'd have to build one up out of all sorts of people, which was what we were obliged to do ourselves, by the way," Coombe threw in as a contribution. "But they will probably have stockbrokers and Wall Street men for officers. Then some of them might give one tips about how to make millions in corners. I don't know what corners are, but they make enormities out of them. Starling," with a hilarious tinkle of a laugh, "you know that appallingly gorgeous house of cherry chestons in Palace Garden? Did she ever tell you that it was the result of a tip a queer Chicago man managed for her? He liked her. He used to call her Cherry Ripe when they were alone. He was big and red and half boyish, sentimental and half blustering. Cherry was ripe, you know, and he liked the ripe style. I should like to have a Chicago stockbroker of my own. I wish the Americans would come in." The Dowager Duchess of Darte and Lord Coombe had been of those who had begun their talk of this in the early days. "Personally, I believe they will come in," Coombe had always said. And on different occasions he had added reasons which, combined, formulated themselves into the following arguments. "We don't really know much of the Americans, though they have been buying and selling and marrying us for some time. Our insular trick of feeling superior has held us mentally aloof from half the globe. But presumably the United States was from the first, in itself, an ideal, pure and simple. It was. It is asinine to pooh-pooh it. A good deal is said about that sort of thing in their histories and speeches. They keep it before each other, and it has had the effect of suggesting ideals on all sides, which has resulted in laying a sort of foundation of men who believe in the ideals and would fight for them. They are good fighters, and, when the sincere ones begin, they will plant their flag where the insincere and mere politicians will be forced to stand by it to save their faces. A few louder brays from Berlin, a few more threats of hoofs trampling on the Star-Spangled Banner, and the fuse will be fired. An American fuse might turn out an amazing thing, because the ideals do exist, and ideals are inflammable. This had been in the early days spoken of. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. Harrowby and the rest did not carry on their war work in the slice of a house. It was of an order requiring a more serious atmosphere. Feather saw even the starling less and less. "Since the Dowager took her up, she's far too grand for the likes of us," she said. So to speak, Feather blew about from one place to another. She had never found life so exciting, and excitement had become more vitally necessary to her existence as the years had passed. She still looked extraordinarily youthful, and if her face was at times rather marvellous in its white and red, and her lips daring in their pomegranate scarlet, the fine grain of her skin aided her effects, and she was dazzlingly in the fashion. She had never worn such enchanting clothes, and never had seemed to possess so many. "I twist my rags together myself," she used to laugh. "That's my gift. Helene says I have genius. I don't mean that I sit and sew. I have a little slave woman who does that by the day. She admires me and will do anything that I tell her. Things are so delightfully scant and short now that you can cut 2 or 3 frocks out of one of your old petticoats, and mine were never very old." There was probably a modicum of truth in this. The fact remained that the garments which were more scant and shorter than those of any other feathery person were also more numerous and exquisite. Her patriotic entertainment of soldiers who required her special order of support and recreation was fast and furious. She danced with them at cabarets. She danced as a nymph for patriotic entertainments, with snow white, bare feet and legs, and a swathing of spring woodland green tulle and leaves and primroses. She was such a success that important personages smiled on her and asked her to appear under undreamed of auspices. Secretly triumphant though she was, she never so far lost her head as to do anything which would bore her or cause her to appear at less than an alluring advantage. When she could invent a particularly unique and inspiring shred of a garment to startle the public with, she danced for some noble object and intoxicated herself with the dazzle of light and applause. She found herself strung to her highest pitch of excitement by the air raids, which, in the midst of their terrors, had the singular effect of exciting many people and filling them with an insane recklessness. Those so excited somehow seemed to feel themselves immune. Feather chattered about Zepps as if bombs could only wreak their vengeance upon coast towns and the lower orders. When Lord Coombe definitely refused to allow her to fit up the roof of the slice of a house as a sort of luxurious royal box from which she and her friends might watch the spectacle, she found among her circle of acquaintances who shared her thrills and had prepared places for themselves. Sometimes she was even rather indecently exhilarated
by her sense of high adventure. The fact was that the excitement of the seething world about her had overstrung her trivial being and turned her light head until it whirled too fast. "It may seem horrid to say so, and I'm not horrid, but I like the War. You know what I mean. London never was so thrilling, with things happening every minute, and all sorts of silly solemn fads swept away so that one can do as one likes. And interesting, heroic men coming and going in swarms and being so grateful for kindness and entertainment. One is really doing good all the time and being adored for it. I own I like being adored myself. And of course one likes doing good. I never was so happy in my life. I used to be rather a coward, I suppose," she chattered gaily on another occasion. "I was horribly afraid of things. I believe the war and living among soldiers has had an effect on me and made me braver. The Zepps don't frighten me at all. At least they excite me so that they make me forget to be frightened. I don't know what they do to me exactly. The whole thing gets into my head and makes me want to rush about and see everything. I wouldn't go into a cellar for worlds. I want to see." She saw Lord Coombe but infrequently at this time, the truth being that her exhilaration and her war work fatigued him, apart from which his hours were filled. He also objected to a certain raffishness which in an extremely mixed crowd of patriots rather too obviously swept away silly old fads and left the truly advanced to do as they liked. What they liked he did not, and was wholly undisturbed by the circumstances of being considered a rigid old fossil. Feather herself had no need of him. An athletic and particularly well-favoured young actor who shared her thrills of elation seemed to permeate the atmosphere about her. He and Feather together at times achieved the effect, between raids, of waiting impatiently for a performance and feeling themselves ill-treated by the long delays between the acts. "Are we growing callous? Or are we losing our wits through living at such high temperature?" the Duchess asked. "There's a delirium in the air. Among those who are not shuddering in cellars there are some who seem possessed by a sort of light insanity, half defiance, half excited curiosity. People say exultantly, 'I had a perfectly splendid view of the last Zepp.' A mother whose daughter was paying her a visit said to her, 'I wish you could have seen the Zepps while you were here. It is such an experience.' They have not been able to bring about the wholesale disaster Germany hoped for, and when nothing serious happens there is a relieved feeling that the things are futile after all," said Coombe. "When the results are tragic they must be hushed up as far as is possible to prevent panic." Dowie faithfully sent him her private bulletin. Her first fears of peril had died away, but her sense of mystification had increased and was more deeply touched with awe. She opened certain windows every night and felt that she was living in the world of supernatural things. Robin's eyes sometimes gave her a ghost of a shock when she came upon her sitting alone with her work in her idle hands. But supported by the testimony of such realities as breakfasts, long untiring walks, and unvarying blooming healthfulness, she thanked God hourly. "Dr. Benton says plain that he has never had such a beautiful case and one that promised so well," she wrote. "He says she's as strong as a young doe bounding about on the heather. What he holds is that it's natural she should be. He is a clever gentleman with some wonderful comforting new ideas about things, my lord, and he tells me I need not look forward with dread, as perhaps I had been doing. Robin herself wrote to Coombe letters whose tender hearted comprehension of what he was doing always held the desire to surround him with the soothing quiet he had so felt when he was with her. What he discovered was that she had been born of the elect, the women who know what to say, what to let others say, and what to beautifully leave unsaid. Her unconscious genius was quite exquisite. Now and then he made the night journey to Darreuch Castle, and each time she met him with her frank childlike kiss he was more amazed and uplifted by her aspect. Their quiet talks together were wonderful things to remember. She had done much fine and dainty work which she showed him with unaffected sweetness. She told him stories of Dowie and Mademoiselle and how they had taught her to sew and embroider. Once she told him the story of her first meeting with Donal, but she passed over the tragedy of their first parting. "It was too sad," she said. He noticed that she never spoke of sad and dark hours. He was convinced that she purposefully avoided them, and he was profoundly glad. "I know," she said once, "that you do not want me to talk to you about the war." "Thank you for knowing it," he answered. "I come here on a pilgrimage to a shrine where peace is. Darreuch is my shrine." "It is mine, too," was her low response. "Yes, I think it is." His look at her was deep. Suddenly but gently he laid his hand on her shoulder. "I beg you," he said fervently, "I beg you never to allow yourself to think of it. Blot the accursed thing out of the universe while you are here. For you there must be no war." How kind his face looked, was Robin's thought as he hesitated a second and then went on. "I know very little of such sacrosanct things as mothers and children, but lately I have had fancies of a place for them where there are only smiles and happiness and beauty as a beginning." It was she who now put her hand on his arm. "Little Darreuch is like that, and you gave it to me," she said. Chapter XXXVII of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter XXXVII. Lord Coombe was ushered into the little drawing room by an extremely immature young footman who, doubtless as a consequence of his immaturity, appeared upon the scene too suddenly. The war left one only servants who were idiots or barely out of board schools, Feather said, and in fact it was something suggesting a scene upon which Coombe was announced. The athletic and personable young actor, entitled upon programmes Owen Delamore, was striding to and fro talking excitedly. There was theatrical emotion in the air, and Feather, delicately flushed and elate, was listening with an air half frightened, half pleased. The immaturity of the footman immediately took fright, and the youth turning at once produced the fatal effect of fleeing precipitately. Mr. Owen Delamore suddenly ceased speaking, and would doubtless have flushed vividly if he had not already been so high of colour as to preclude the possibility of his flushing at all. The scene, which was plainly one of emotion, being intruded upon in its midst, left him transfixed on his expression of anguish, pleading and reproachful protest, all thrilling and confusing things. The very serenity of Lord Coombe's apparently unobserving entrance was perhaps a shock as well as a relief. It took even Feather 2 or 3 seconds to break into her bell of a laugh as she shook hands with her visitor. Mr. Delamore is going over his big scene in the new play," she explained with apt swiftness of resource. "It's very good, but it excites him dreadfully. I've been told that great actors don't let themselves get all excited at all, so he ought not to do it, ought he, Lord Coombe?" Coombe was transcendently well behaved. "I am a yawning abyss of ignorance in such matters, but I cannot agree with the people who say that emotion can be expressed without feeling." He himself expressed exteriorly merely intelligent consideration of the idea. "That, however, may be solely the opinion of one benighted." It was so well done that the young athlete, in the relief of relaxed nerves, was almost hysterically inclined to believe in Feather's adroit statement and to feel that he really had been acting. He was at least able to pull himself together, to become less flushed, and to sit down with some approach to an air of being lightly amused at himself. "Well, it is proved that I am not a great actor," he achieved. "I can't come anywhere near doing it. I don't believe Irving ever did, or Conklin. But perhaps it is one of my recommendations that I don't aspire to be great. At any rate, people only ask to be amused and helped out just now. It will be a long time before they want anything else, it's my opinion." They conversed amiably together for nearly a quarter of an hour before Mr. Owen Delamore went on his way, murmuring polite regrets concerning impending rehearsals, his secret gratitude expressing itself in special courtesy to Lord Coombe. As he was leaving the room, Feather called to him airily, "If you hear any more of the Zepps, just dash in and tell me. Don't lose a minute. Just dash." When the front door was heard to close upon him, Coombe remarked casually, "I will ask you to put an immediate stop to that sort of thing." He observed that Feather fluttered, though she had lightly moved to a table as if to rearrange a flower in a group. "Put a stop to letting Mr. Delamore go over his scene here?" "Put a stop to Mr. Delamore, if you please." It was at this moment more than ever true that her light being was overstrung and that her light head whirled too fast. This one particular, also overstrung young man had shared all her amusements with her and had ended by pleasing her immensely, perhaps to the verge of inspiring a touch of fevered sentiment she had previously never known. She told herself it was the War when she thought of it. She had, however, not been clever enough to realise that she was a little losing her head in a way which might not be to her advantage. For the moment she lost it completely. She almost whirled around as she came to Coombe. "I won't!" she exclaimed. "I won't!" It was a sort of shock to him. She had never done anything like it before. It struck him that he had never before seen her look as she looked at the moment. She was a shade too dazzlingly made up. She had crossed the line on one side of which lies the art, which is perfect. Even her dress had a suggestion of wartime lack of restraint in its style and colours. It was of a strange green, and a very long scarf of an intensely vivid violet, spangled with silver paillettes, and was swathed around her bare shoulders and floated from her arms. One of the signs of her excitement was that she kept twisting its ends without knowing that she was touching it. He noted that she wore a big purple amethyst ring, the amethyst too big. Her very voice was less fine in its inflections, and as he swiftly took in these points, Coombe recognised that they were the actual result of the slight tone of raffishness he had observed as denoting the character of her increasingly mixed circle. She threw herself into a chair palpitating in one of her rages of a little cat. wreathing her scarf round and round her wrist, and singularly striking him with the effect of almost spitting and hissing out her words. "I won't give up everything I like and that likes me," she flung out. "The war has done something to us all. It's made us let ourselves go. It's done something to me too. It's made me less frightened. I won't be bullied into things." "Do I seem to bully you? I am sorry." The fact that she had let herself go with the rest of the world got the better of her. "You have not been near me for weeks, and now you turn up with your air of grand bashaw and order people out of my house. You have not been near me." The next instant it was as though she tore off some last shred of mental veiling and threw it aside in her reckless mounting heat of temper. "Near me!" she laughed, scathing. "For the matter of that, when have you ever been near me? It's always been the same. I've known it for years. As the Yankees say, you wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole. I'm sick of it. What did you do it for?" "Do what?" "Take possession of me as if I were your property. You never were in love with me. Never for a second. If you had been, you'd have married me." "Yes, I should have married you." "There was no reason why you should not. I was pretty. I was young. I'd been decently brought up. And it would have settled everything. Why didn't you instead of letting people think I was your mistress when I didn't count for as much as a straw in your life?" "You represented more than that," he answered. "Kindly listen to me." That she had lost her head completely was sufficiently manifested by the fact that she had begun to cry, which made it necessary for her to use her handkerchief, with inimitable skill, to prevent the tears from encroaching on her brilliant white and rose. "If you had been in love with me!" she chafed bitterly. "On the morning some years ago when I came to you I made myself clear to the best of my ability," he said. "I did not mention love. I told you that I had no intention of marrying you. I called your attention to what the world would assume. I left the decision to you." "What could I do without a penny? Some other man would have had to do it if you had not," the letting go rushed her into saying. "Or you would have been obliged to return to your parents in Jersey, which you refused to contemplate." "Of course I refused. It would have been mad to do it. And there were other people who would have paid my bills." "Solely because I knew that, I made my proposition. Being much older than you, I realised that other people might not feel the responsibility binding and permanent." She sat up and stared at him. There was no touch of the rancour of recrimination in his presentation of detached facts. He was different from the rest. He was always better dressed, and the perfection of his impersonal manner belonged to a world being swept away. He made Mr. Owen Delamore seem by contrast a bounder and an outsider. But the fact which had in the secret places of her small mind been the fly in her ointment, the one fact that he had never for a moment cared a straw for her, caused her actually to hate him as he again made it, quite without prejudice, crystal clear. It was true that he had more than kept his word, that he had never broken a convention in his bearing towards her, that in his rigid way he had behaved like a prince, but she had been dirt under his feet. She had been dirt under his feet. She wanted to rave like a fishwife, though there were no fishwives in Mayfair. It was at this very moment of climax that a sudden memory beset her. Rob always said that if a woman who was pretty could see a man often enough, again and again, he couldn't help himself, unless there was someone else. Her last words were fiercely accusing. She quite glared at him a few seconds, her chest heaving pantingly. She suddenly sprang from her sofa and dashed towards a table where a pile of photographs lay in an untidy little heap. She threw them about with angrily shaking hands, until at last she caught at one and brought it back to him. "There was some one else," she laughed shrilly. "You were in love with that creature." It was one of the photos of Alixe such as the Bond Street shop had shown in its windows. She made a movement as if to throw it into the grate, and he took it from her hand, saying nothing whatever. "I'd forgotten about it until Owen Delamore reminded me only yesterday," she said. "He's a romantic thing, and he heard that you had been in attendance and had been sent to their castle in Germany. He worked the thing out in his own way. He said you had chosen me because I was like her. I can see now I was like her." "If you had been like her," his voice was intensely bitter, "I should have asked you to be my wife. You are as unlike her as one human being can be to another."
"But I was enough like her to make you take me up," she cried furiously.
"I have neither taken you up nor put you down," he answered. "Be good enough never to refer to the subject again."
"I'll refer to any subject I like. If you think I shall not, you are mistaken. It will be worth talking about. An early Victorian romance is worth something in these days."
The trend of her new circle had indeed carried her far. He was privately appalled by her. She was hysterically, passionately spiteful, almost to the point of malignance. "Do you realise that this is a scene? It has not been our habit to indulge in scenes," he said.
"I shall speak about it as freely as I shall speak about Robin," she flaunted at him, wholly unrestrained. "Do you think I know nothing about Robin? I'm an affectionate mother, and I've been making inquiries. She's not with the Dowager at Eaton Square. She got ill and was sent away to be hidden in the country. Girls are sometimes. I thought she would be sent away somewhere the day I met her in the street. She looked exactly like the sort of thing. Where is she? I demand to know."
There's nothing so dangerous to others as the mere spitefully malignant temper of an empty headed creature giving itself up to its own weak fury. It knows no restraint, no limit in its folly. In her fantastic broodings over her daughter's undue exaltation of position, Feather had many times invented for her own entertainment little scenes in which she could score satisfactorily. Such scenes had always included Coombe, the Dowager, Robin, and Mrs. Muir.
"I am her mother. She is not of age. I can demand to see her. I can make her come home and stay with me while I see her through her 'trouble,' as pious people call it. She's got herself into trouble, just like a housemaid. I knew she would. I warned her," and her laugh was actually shrill.
It was inevitable and ghastly that he should suddenly see Robin with her white eyelids dropped over her basket of sewing by the window in the Tower room at Darreuch. It rose as clear as a picture on a screen, and he felt sick with actual terror.
"I'll go to the Duchess and ask her questions until she can't face me without telling me the truth. If she's nasty, I'll talk to the Warwick people who crowd her house. They all saw Robin, and the wide awake ones will understand when I'm eternal and tragic and insist on knowing. I'll go to Mrs. Muir and talk to her. It will be fun to see her face and the Duchess's." He had never suspected her of malice such as this.
and even in the midst of his ghastly dismay he saw that it was merely the malice of an angrily spiteful, selfish child of bad training and with no heart. There was nothing to appeal to, nothing to arrest and control. She might repent her insanity in a few days, but for the period of her mood she would do her senseless worst. "Your daughter has not done what you profess to believe," he said. "You do not believe it. Will you tell me why you propose to do these things?" She had worked herself up to utter recklessness. "Because of everything," she spat out. "Because I'm in a rage. Because I'm sick of her and her duchesses. And I'm most sick of you hovering about her as if she were a princess of the blood and you were her Grand Chamberlain. Why don't you marry her yourself, baby and all? Then you'll be sure there'll be another head of the House of Coombe." She knew then that she had raved like a fishwife, that, even though there had before been no fishwives in Mayfair, he saw one standing shrilling before him. It was in his eyes, and she knew it before she had finished speaking, for his look was maddening. It enraged her even further, and she shook in the air the hand with the big purple amethyst ring, still clutching the end of the bedizened purple scarf. She was intoxicated with triumph, for she had reached him. "I will! I will!" she cried. "I will to-morrow!" "You will not!" His voice rang out as she had never heard it before. He even took a step forward. Then came the hurried leap of feet up the narrow staircase, and Owen Delamore flung the door wide, panting. "You told me to dash in," he almost shouted. "They're coming! We can rush round to the Sinclairs. They're on the roof already." She caught the purple scarf around her and ran towards him, for at this new excitement her frenzy reached its highest note. "I will! I will!" she called back to Coombe, as she fled out of the room and held up and waved at him again the hand with the big amethyst. "I will to-morrow!" Lord Coombe was left standing in the garish, crowded little drawing room, listening to ominous sounds in the street, to cries, running feet, and men on fleeing bicycles shouting warnings as they sped at top speed and strove to clear the way. Chapter XXXVIII of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XXXVIII. It was one of the raids which left hellish things behind it, things hushed with desperate combined effort to restrain panic, but which blighted the air people strove to breathe and kept men and women shuddering for long after, and made people waken with sharp cries from nightmares of horror. Certain paled faces belonged to those who had seen things and would never forget them. Others strove to look defiant and cheerful and did not find it easy. Some tried to get past policemen to certain parts of the city, and some, getting past, returned livid and less adventurous in spirit because they had heard things it was gruesome to hear. Lord Coombe went the next morning to the slice of a house and found the servants rather hysterical. Feather had not returned, but they were not hysterical for that reason. She had probably remained at the house to which she had gone to see the Zepps. After the excitement was over, people like the Sinclairs were rather inclined to restore themselves by making a night of it, so to speak. As to-morrow had now arrived, Lord Coombe wished to see her on her return. He had, in fact, lain awake thinking of plans of defence, but had so far been able to decide on none. If there had been anything to touch, to appeal to, there might have been some hope. but she had left taste and fastidiousness scattered in shreds behind her. The war, as she put it, had made her less afraid of life. She had, in fact, joined the army of women who could always live so long as their beauty lasted. At the beginning of her relations with Lord Coombe she had belonged in a sense to a world which now no longer existed in its old form. Possibly there would soon be neither courts nor duchesses, and so why should anything particular matter? There were those who were taking cataclysms lightly, and she was among them. If her airy mind chanced to have veered and her temper died down, money or jewels might induce her to keep quiet if one could endure the unspeakable indignity of forcing oneself to offer them. She would feel such an offer no indignity, and would probably regard it as a tremendous joke. But she could no more be trusted than a female monkey or jackdaw. Lord Coombe sat among the gewgaws in the drawing room and waited, because he must see her when she came in, and at least discover if the weathercock had veered. After waiting an hour or more, he heard a taxi arrive at the front door and stop there. He went to the window to see who got out of the vehicle. It gave him a slight shock to recognise a man he knew well. He wore plain clothes, but he was a member of the police force. He evidently came into the house and stopped in the hall to talk to the immature footman, who presently appeared at the drawing room door, looking shaken because he had been questioned and did not know what it portended. "What is the matter?" Lord Coombe assisted him with. "Someone who is asking about Mrs. Gareth Lawless. He doesn't seem satisfied with what I tell him. I took the liberty of saying your lordship was here and perhaps you'd see him. Bring him upstairs." It was in fact a man who knew Lord Coombe well enough to be aware that he need make no delay. "It was one of the worst, my lord," he said in answer to Coombe's first question. "We've had hard work, and the hardest of it was to hold things people back." He looked hag-ridden as he went on without any preparation. He was too tired for prefaces. "There was a lady who went out of here last night. She was with a gentleman. They were running to a friend's house to see things from the roof. They didn't get there. The gentleman is in the hospital delirious to-day. He doesn't know what happened. It's supposed something frightened her and she lost her wits and ran away. The gentleman tried to follow her, but the lights were out and he couldn't find her in the dark streets. The running about and all the noises and crashes sent him rather wild perhaps, trying to find a frightened woman in the midst of all that, and not finding her." "What ghastly, damnable thing has happened?" Coombe asked with stiff lips. "It's both," the man said. "It's both." He produced a package and opened it. There was a torn and stained piece of spangled violet gauze folded in it, and on top was a little cardboard box, which he opened also to show a ring with a big amethyst in it set with pearls. "Good God!" Coombe ejaculated, getting up from his chair hastily. "Oh! Good God!" "You know them?" the man asked. "Yes. I saw them last night before she went out. She ran the wrong way. She must have been crazy with fright. This " the man hesitated a second here and pulled himself together. "This is all that was found except " "Good God!" said Lord Coombe again, and he walked to and fro rapidly, trying to hold his body rigid. "The gentleman his name is Delamore went on looking after the raid was over. Some one saw him running here and there as if he had gone crazy. He was found afterwards where he'd fainted, near a woman's hand with this ring on, and the piece of scarf in it. He's a strong young chap, but he'd fainted dead. He was carried to the hospital and to day he's delirious." "There was nothing more?" shuddered Coombe. "Nothing, my lord." Out of unbounded space, embodied nothingness had seemed to float across the world of living things, and into space the nothingness had disappeared, leaving behind a trinket and a rent scrap of purple gauze. Chapter XXXIX. XXXIX. 6 weeks later Coombe was driven again up the climbing road to Darreuch. There was something less of colour than usual in his face, but the slightly vivid look of shock observing persons had been commenting upon had died out. As he had travelled, leaning back upon the cushions of the railway carriage, he had kept his eyes closed for the greater part of the journey. When at last he began to open them and look out at the increasingly beautiful country, he also began to look rested and calm. He already felt the nearing peace of the shrine, and added to it was an immense relaxing and uplift. A girl of a type entirely different from Robin's might, he knew, have made him feel during the past months as if he were taking part in a melodrama. This she had wholly saved him from by the clear simplicity of her natural acceptance of all things as they were. She had taken and given without a word. He was, as it were, going home to her now, as deeply thrilled and moved as a totally different type of man might have gone, a man who was simpler. The things he might once have been and felt were at work within him. Again he longed to see the girl, he wanted to see her. He was going to the castle in response to a telegram from Dowie. All was well over. She was safe. For the rest, all calamity had been kept from her knowledge and, as he had arranged it, the worst would never reach her. In course of time she would learn all it was necessary that she should know of her mother's death. When Mrs. Macaur led him to one of his own rooms, she glowed red and expectantly triumphant. "The young lady, your lordship. It was wonderful." But before she had time to say more, Dowie had appeared, and her face was smooth and serene to marvellousness. "The Almighty himself has been in this place, my lord," she said devoutly. "I didn't send more than a word, because she's like a schoolroom child about it. She wants to tell you herself." The woman was quivering with pure joy. "May I see her?" "She's waiting, my lord." Honey scents of gorse and heather blew softly through the open windows of the room he was taken to. He did not know enough of such things to be at all sure what he had expected to see, but what he moved quickly towards, the moment after his entrance, was Robin lying fair as a wild rose on her pillows, not pale, not tragic, but with her eyes wide and radiant as a shining child's. Her smiling made his heart stand still. He really could not speak. But she could, and turned back the covering to show him what lay in her soft curved arm. "He is not like me at all," was her joyous exulting. "He is exactly like Donal." The warm, tender breathing, semi dormant, scarcely sentient seeming thing might indeed have been the reincarnation of what had in the past so peculiarly reached bodily perfection. Robin, who mysteriously knew every line and curve of the new born body, could point out how each limb and feature was an embryonic replica. "Though he looks so tiny, he is not really little," was her lovely yearning boast. "He is really very big. Dowie has known hundreds of babies, and they were none of them as big as he is. He is a giant an angel giant," burying her face in the soft red neck. "It seemed to change me into another type of man," Coombe once said to the Duchess. The man into whom he had been transformed was he who lived through the next few days at Darreuch even as though life were a kindly faithful thing. Many other men, he told himself, must have lived as he did, and he wondered if any of them ever forgot it. It was a thing set apart. He sat by Robin's side. They talked together. He retired to his own rooms or went out for a long walk, coming back to her to talk again, or read aloud, or to consider with her the marvel of the small thing by her side, examining curled hands and feet with curious interest. "But though they look so little, they are not really," she always said. "See how long his fingers are and how they taper. And his foot is so long, too, and narrow and arched. Donal's was like it." "Was," she said, and he wondered if she might not feel a pang as he himself did. He wondered often, and sometimes, when he sat alone in his room at night, found something more than wonder in his mind, something that, if she had not forbidden it, would have been fear because of strange things he saw in her. He could not question her. He dared not even remotely touch on the dream. She was so well, her child was so well. She was as any young mother might have been who could be serene in her husband's absence because she knew he was safe and would soon return. "Is she always as calm?" he once asked Dowie. "Does she never seem to be reminded of what would have been if he were alive?" Dowie shook her head, and he saw that the old anxiousness came back upon her. "My lord, she believes he is alive when she sees him. That's what troubles me even in my thankfulness. I don't understand, God help me. I was afraid when she saw the child that it might all come over her again in a way that would do her awful harm. But when I laid the little thing down by her she just lay there herself and looked at it as if something was uplifting her. And in a few seconds she whispered, 'He is like Donal.' And then she said to herself, soft but quite clear, 'Donal, Donal,' and never a tear rose. Perhaps," hesitating over it, "it's the blessedness of time. A child's a wonderful thing, and so is time. Sometimes," a queer sigh broke from her, "when I've been hard put to it by trouble I've said to myself, 'Well, the Almighty did give us time, whatever else He takes away.'" But Coombe mysteriously felt that it was not merely time which had calmed her, though any explanation founded on material reasoning became more remote each day. The thought which came to him at times had no connection with temporal things. He found he was gravely asking himself what aspect mere life would have worn if Elixie had come to him every night in such form as had given him belief in the absolute reality of her being. If he had been convinced that he had heard the voice of Elixie, if she had smiled and touched him with her white hands as she had never touched him in life, if her eyes had been unafraid and they had spoken together only of happy things, and had understood as one soul, what could the mere days have held of hurt? There was only one possible reply, and it seemed to explain his feeling that she was sustained by something which was not alone the mere blessedness of time. He became conscious one morning of the presence of a new expression in her eyes. There was a brave radiance in them, and before he had known that in their radiance There had been no necessity for bravery. He felt a subtle but curious difference. Her child had been long asleep and she lay like a white dove on her pillows when he came to make his brief good night visit. She was very still and seemed to be thinking. Her touch on his arm was as the touch of a butterfly when she at last put out her hand to him. "He may not come to night," she said. He put his own hand over hers and hoped it was done quietly. "But to morrow night?" trusting that his tone was quiet also. It must be quiet. "Perhaps not for a good many nights. He does not know. I must not ask things. I never do. But it has been so wonderful that you know." On what plane was he? On what plane was she? What plane were they talking about with such undoubtingness? Heaven be praised his voice actually sounded natural. "I do not know much except that he is Donal. And I can never feel as if I were dead again. Never." "No," he answered. "Never." She lay so still for a few minutes that if her eyes had not been open he would have thought she was falling asleep. They were so dreamy that perhaps she was falling asleep, and he rose softly to leave her. "I think he is trying to come nearer," she murmured. "Good night, dear." Chapter
40 of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. Ominous hours had come and gone. Waves of gloom had surged in and receded, but never receded far enough. It was as though the rising and falling of some primeval storm was the background of all thought and life, and its pandemonium of sound foretold the far-off heaving of some vast tidal wave, gathering its unearthly power as it swelled. Coombe, talking to his close friend in her few quiet hours at Eaton Square, found a support in the very atmosphere surrounding her. "The world at war creates a prehistoric uproar," he said. "The earth called out of chaos to take form may have produced some such tempestuous crash. But there is a far off glow. You believe something. I believe too. But the prehistoric darkness and uproar are so appalling. One loses hold." The Duchess leaned forward, her voice dropping. "What do you know that I do not?" "The light usually breaks in the East," Coombe answered. "It is breaking in the West to day. It has always been there and it has been spreading from the first. At any moment it may set the sky aflame." For as time has gone on the world had beheld the colossal spectacle of a huge nation in the melting pot. And as it was as a nation the composite result of the fusion of all the countries of the earth, the breath-suspended lookers-on beheld it in effect, passionately commercial, passionately generous, passionately sordid, passionately romantic, chivalrous, cautious, limited, bounded. As American wealth and sympathy poured in where need was most dire, bitterness became silent through sheer discretion's sake, when for no more honest reason, as the commercial tendency expressed itself in readiness and efficiency, sneering condemnation had become less loud. "It will happen. It is the result of the ideals really," Coombe said further. "And it will come to pass at the exact psychological moment. If they had come in at the beginning, they would have faced the first full force of the monstrous tidal wave of the colossal German belief in its own omnipotence. And they would have faced it unawakened, unenraged by monstrosities, and half incredulous of the truth. It was not even their fight then, and raw fighters need a flaming cause. But the Tower of Agonies has built itself to its tottering height before their blazing eyes. Now it is their fight because it is the fight of the whole world. Others have borne the first fierce heat and burden of the day, but they will rush in young and untouched by calamity, bounding, shouting and singing. They will come armed with all that long-born horrors and maddening human fatigue most need. I repeat, it will occur at the exact psychological moment. They will bring red-hot blood and furious, unbounded courage. And it will be the end. In fact, Coombe waited with a tense sensation of being too tightly strung. He had hours when he felt that something might snap. But nothing must snap yet. He was too inextricably entangled in the arduous work even to go to Darreuch for rest. He did not go for weeks. All was well there, however, marvellously well it seemed, even when he held in mind a letter from Robin which had ended: "He has not come back, but I am not afraid. I promised him I would never be afraid again." In dark and tired hours he steadied himself with a singular half realised belief that she would not, that somehow some strange thing would be left to her whatsoever was taken away. It was because he felt as if he were nearing the end of his tether. He had become hypersensitive to noises, to the sounds in the streets, to the strain and grief in faces he saw as he walked or drove. After lying awake all one night without a moment of blank peace, he came down, pale, and saw that his hand shook as he held his coffee cup. It was a livid sort of morning, and when he went out for the sake of exercise, he found he was looking at each of the strained faces as if it held some answer to an unformed question. He realised the tenseness of both mind and body had increased. For no reason whatever, he was restrung by a sense of waiting for something, as if something were going to happen. He went back to Coombe House, and when he crossed the threshold he confronted the elderly, unliveried man who had stood at his place for years, and the usually unperturbed face was agitated so nearly to panic that he stopped and addressed him. "Has anything happened?" "My lord, a Red Cross nurse has brought—" He was actually quite unsteady, too unsteady to finish, for the next moment the Red Cross nurse was at his side, looking very whitely fresh and clean and with a nice, serious, youngish face. "I need not prepare you for good news, even if it is a sort of shock," she said, watching him closely. "I have brought Captain Muir back to you." "You have brought!" he exclaimed. "He has been in one of the worst German prisons. He was left for dead on the field and taken prisoner. We must not ask him questions. I don't know why he is alive. He escaped, God knows how. At this time he does not know himself. I saw him on the boat. He asked me to take charge of him." She spoke very quickly. "He is a skeleton, poor boy. Come." She led the way to his own private room. She went on talking short, hurried sentences, but he scarcely heard her. This, then, was what he had been waiting for. Why had he not known? This tremendous thing was really not so tremendous after all, because it had happened in other cases before, yet he had never once thought of it. He would not let his wife or his mother see him until he looked more like himself. he heard the Red Cross nurse say as he entered the room. Donal was lying stretched at full length on a sofa. He looked abnormally long because he was so thin that he was, as the nurse had said, a skeleton. His face was almost a death's head, but his blue eyes looked out of their great hollow sockets clear as tarn water, and with a smile which Coombe would not have forgotten howsoever long life had dragged out. "Be very careful," whispered the nurse. He knew he must be careful. Only the eyes were alive. The body was a collapsed thing. He seemed scarcely breathing. His voice was a thread. "Robin!" Coombe caught as he bent close to him. "Robin!" "She is well, dear boy." How his voice shook. "I have taken care of her." The light leapt up into the blue for a second. The next the lids dropped and the nurse sprang forward because he had slipped into a faint so much like death that it might well have rent hope from a looker on. For the next hour, and indeed for many following, there was unflagging work to be done. The Red Cross nurse was a capable, swiftly moving woman, with her resources at her fingers' ends and her quick wits about her. Almost immediately 2 doctors from the staff in charge of the rooms upstairs were on the spot and at work with her. By what lightning flashed sentences she conveyed to them, without pausing for a second, the facts it was necessary for them to know, was incomprehensible to Coombe, who could only stand afar off and wait, watching the dead face, its sunken temples, cheeks and eyes, and the sharply carven bone outline were heart-gripping. It seemed hours before one of the doctors, as he bent over the couch, whispered, "The breathing is a little better." It was not possible that he should be moved, but the couch was broad and deeply upholstered and could be used temporarily as a bed. Every resource of medical science was within reach. Nurse Jones, who had been on her way home to take a rest, was so far ensnared by unusual interest that she wished to be allowed to remain on duty. There were other nurses who could be called on at any moment of either night or day. There were doctors of indisputable skill who were also fired by the mere histrionic features of the case. The handsome, fortunate young fellow who had been supposed to torn to fragments had by some incomprehensible luck been aided to drag himself home, perhaps to die of pure exhaustion. Was it really hours before Coombe saw the closed eyes weakly open? But the smile was gone, and they seemed to be looking at something not in the room. "They will come in." The words dragged out scarcely to be heard. "Jackson said they would." The eyes dropped again, and the breathing was a mere flutter. Nurse Jones was in fact filled with much curiosity concerning and interest in the Marquis of Coombe. She was a clever and well-trained person, but socially a simple creature, who in an inoffensive way loved a lord. If her work had not absorbed her, she could not have kept her eyes from this finely conventional and rather unbending looking man, who, keeping himself out of the way of all who were in charge of the seemingly almost dead boy, still would not leave the room, and watched him with a restrained passion of such feeling as it was not natural to see in the eyes of men. Marquis or not, he had gone through frightful things in his life, and this boy meant something tremendous to him. If he couldn't be brought back. Despite the work, her swift eye darted sideways at the Marquis. When at length another nurse took her place and she was going out of the room, he moved quickly towards her and spoke. "May I ask if I may speak to you alone for a few minutes? I have no right to keep you from your rest. I assure you I won't." "I'll come," she answered. What she saw in the man's face was that, because she had brought the boy, he actually clung to her. She had been clung to many times before, but never by a man who looked quite like this. There was more than you could see. He led her to a smaller room near by. He made her sit down, but he did not sit himself. It was plain that he did not mean to keep her from her bed, though he was in hard case if ever man was. His very determination not to impose on her caused her to make up her mind to tell him all she could, though it wasn't much. "Captain Muir's mother believes that he is dead," he said. "It is plain that no excitement must approach him, even another person's emotion. He was her idol. She is in London. Must I send for her, or would it be safe to wait?" "There have been minutes to day when if I'd known he had a mother I should have said she must be sent for," was her answer. "To night I believe yes, I do that it would be better to wait and watch. Of course the doctors must really decide." "Thank you. I will speak to them. But I confess I wanted to ask you. How did he cling to her?" "Thank you," he said again. "I will not keep you." He opened the door and waited for her to pass, as if she had been a marchioness herself, she thought. In spite of his desperate eyes he didn't forget a single thing. He so moved her that she actually turned back. "You don't know anything yet. Some one you're fond of coming back from the grave must make you half mad to know how it happened," she said. "I don't know much myself, but I'll tell you all I was able to find out. He was light headed when I found him trying to get on the boat. When I spoke to him he just caught my hand and begged me to stay with him. He wanted to get to you. He'd been wandering about, starved and hiding. If he'd been himself he would have got help earlier, but he'd been ill treated and had seen things that made him lose his balance. He couldn't tell a clear story. He was too weak to talk clearly. But I asked questions now and then and listened to every word he said when he rambled because of his fever. Jackson was a fellow prisoner who died of hemorrhage brought on by brutality. Often I couldn't understand him, but he kept bringing in the name of Jackson. One thing puzzled me very much. He said several times, 'Jackson taught me to dream of Robin. I should never have seen Robin if I hadn't known Jackson.' Now Robin is a boy's name, but he said her and she 2 or 3 times as if it were a girl's." "Robin is his wife," said Coombe. He really found the support of the door he still held open useful for the moment. An odd new interest sharpened in her eyes. "Then he's been dreaming of her!" She almost jerked it out, as if in sudden illumination, almost relief. "He's been dreaming of her, and it may have kept him alive." She paused as if she were asking questions of her own mind. "I wonder," dropped from her in slow speculation, "if she has been dreaming of him. He was not dead. He was not an angel. He was Donal." Robin had persisted from the first. He had not been dead. In some incredible, hideous German prison, in the midst of inhuman horrors and the blackness of what must have been despair, he had been alive and had dreamed as she had. Nurse Jones looked at him, waiting. Even if nurses had not been, presumably, under some such bond of honourable secrecy as constrained the medical profession, he knew she was to be trusted. Her very look told him. "She did dream of him," he said. "She was slipping fast down the slope to death,
and he caught her back. He saved her life and her child's. She was going to have a child. They were both quite silent for a few moments. The room was still. Then the woman drew her hand with a quick odd gesture across her forehead. "Queer things happened in the last century, but queerer ones are going to happen in this, if people will let them. Doctors and nurses see and think a lot they can't talk about. They're always on the spot at what seems to be the beginning and the ending. These black times have opened up the ways. Queer things," I said with sudden forcefulness. "They're not queer. It's only laws we haven't known about. It's the writing on the scroll that we couldn't read. We're just learning the alphabet." Then after a minute more of thought, "Those two, were they particularly fond of each other? More to each other than most young couples?" "They loved each other the hour they first met, when they were little children. It was an unnatural shock to them both when they were parted. They seemed to be born mated for life." "That was the reason," she said quite relievedly. "I can understand that. It's as orderly as the stars." Then she added with a sudden, strong, quite normal conviction, and her tiredness seemed to drop from her. "He won't die, that beautiful boy," she said. "He can't. It's not meant. They're going on, those three. He's the most splendid human thing I ever handled, skeleton as he is. His very bones are magnificent as he lies there. And that smile of his that's deep in the blue his eyes are made of, it can only flicker up for a second now, but it can't go out. He's safe, even this minute, though you mayn't believe it." "I do believe it," Coombe said. And he stood there believing it, when she went through the open door and left him. Chapter XLI. of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter XLI. It was long before the dropped eyelids could lift and hold themselves open for more than a few seconds, and long before the eyes wore their old clear look. The depths of the collapse after prolonged tortures of strain and fear was such as demanded a fierce and unceasing fight of skill and unswerving determination on the part of both doctors and nurses. There were hours when what seemed to be strange deathly drops into abysses of space struck terror into most of those who stood by looking on. But Nurse Jones always believed, and so did Coombe. "You needn't send for his mother yet," she said without flinching. "You and I know something the others don't know, Lord Coombe. That child and her baby are holding him back, though they don't know anything about it." It revealed itself to him that her interest in things occult and apparently unexplained by material processes had during the last few years intensely absorbed her in private. Her feeling, though intense, was intelligent, and her processes of argument were often convincing. He became willing to answer her questions because he felt sure of her. He lent her the books he had been reading, and in her hard-earned hours of leisure she plunged deep into them. "Perhaps I read sometimes when I ought to be sleeping, but it rests me. I tell you, it rests me. I'm finding out that there's strength outside of all this and you can draw on it. It's there waiting," she said. "Everybody will know about its being there in course of time." "But the time seems long," said Coombe. Concerning the dream she had many interesting theories. She was at first disturbed and puzzled because it had stopped. She was anxious to find out whether it had come back again, but, like Lord Coombe, she realised that Robin's apparent calm must on no account be disturbed. If her health giving serenity could be sustained for a certain length of time, the gates of heaven would open to her. But at first Nurse Jones asked herself and Lord Coombe some troubled questions. It came about at length that she appeared one night in the room where their first private talk had taken place, and she had presented herself on her way to bed because she had something special to say. "It came to me when I awakened this morning as if it had been told to me in the night. Things often seem to come that way. Do you remember, Lord Coombe, that she said they only talked about happy things?" "Yes, she said it several times," Coombe answered. "Do you remember that he never told her where he came from? And she knew that she must not ask questions? How could he have told her of that hell? How could he?" "You are right quite." "I feel sure I am. When he can talk he will tell you if he remembers. I wonder how much they remember, except the relief and the blessed happiness of it? Lord Coombe, I believe as I believe I'm in this room that when he knew he was going to face the awful risk of trying to escape, he knew he mustn't tell her. And he knew that in crawling through dangers and hiding in ditches he could never be sure of being able to lie down to sleep and concentrate on sending his soul to her. So he told her that he might not come for some time. Oh, Lord! If he'd been caught and killed he could never No! No!" obstinately. "Even then he would have got back in some form in some way. I've got to the point of believing as much as that. He was hers." "Yes yes yes," was all his slow answer. But there was deep thought in each detached word, and when she went away he walked up and down the room with leisurely steps, looking down at the carpet. As many hours of the day and night as those in authority would allow him, Lord Coombe sat and watched by Donal's bed. He watched from well hidden anxiousness to see every subtle change recording itself on his being. He watched from throbbing affection and longing to see at once any tinge of growing natural colour, any unconscious movement, perhaps a shade stronger than the last. It was his son who lay there, he told himself. It was the son he had remotely yearned for in his loneliness. If he had been his father watching his sunk lids with bated breath, he would have felt just these unmerciful pangs. He also watched because in the boy's hours of fevered unconsciousness he could at times catch words, sometimes broken sentences, which threw ghastly light upon things past. Sometimes their significance was such as made him shudder. A condition the doctors most dreaded was one in which the monstrous scenes seemed lived again, scenes in which cruelties and maddening suffering and despairing death itself rose vividly from the depth of subconsciousness and cried aloud for vengeance. Sometimes Donal shuddered, tearing at his chest with both hands. More than once he lay sobbing until only skilled effort prevented his sobs from becoming choking danger. "It may be years after he regains his strength," the chief physician said, "years before it will be safe to ask him for detail. On my own part, I would never bring such horrors back to a man. You may have noticed how the men who have borne most absolutely refuse to talk." "It's an accursed fool who tries to make them," broke in one of the younger men. There was a fellow who had been pinned up against a barn door and left to hang there, and a coarse, loud-mouthed lunatic asked him to describe how it felt. The chap couldn't stand it. Do you know what he did? He sprang at him and knocked him down. He apologised afterwards and said it was his nerves, but there's not a man who was there who will ever speak to that other brute again." The man whose name was Jackson seemed to be a clinging memory to the skeleton when its mind wandered in the past Hades. He had been in some way very close to the boy. He had died somehow cruelly. There had been blood and no one would help. Some devil had even laughed. When that scene came back the doctors and nurses held their breath and silently worked hard. Nothing seemed quite as heartrending as what had happened to Jackson, but there were endless other things to shudder at. So the time passed, and Nurse Jones found many times that she must stop at his door on her way to her rest to say, "Don't look like that, Lord Coombe. You need not send for his mother yet." Then at last, and it had been like travelling for months waterless in a desert, she came in one day with a new and elate countenance. "Mrs. Muir is a quiet, self-controlled woman, isn't she?" she asked. "Entirely self-controlled and very quiet," he answered. "Then if you will speak to Dr. Beresford about it, I know he will allow her to see Captain Muir for a few minutes. And, thank God, it's not because if she doesn't see him now she'll never see him alive again. He has all his life before him. Please sit down, nurse." Coombe spoke hastily and placed a chair as he spoke. He did so because he had perceiving eyes. She sat down and covered her face with her apron for a moment. She made no sound or movement, but caught a deep, quick breath 2 or 3 times. The relaxed strain had temporarily overpowered her. She uncovered her face and got up almost immediately. She was not likely to give way openly to her emotions. "Thank you, Lord Coombe," she said. "I've never had a case that gripped hold of me as this has. I've often felt as though that poor half-killed boy was more to me than he is. You might speak to Dr. Beresford now. He's just gone in." Therefore Lord Coombe went that afternoon to the house before which grew the plane trees whose leaves had rustled in the dawn's first wind on the morning Donal had sat and talked with his mother after the night of the Dowager Duchess of Dart's dance. On his way his thoughts were almost uncontrollable things, and he knew the first demand of good sense was that he should control them. But he was like an unbelievable messenger from another world, a dark world unknown because shadows hid it and would not let themselves be perceived by streaming human eyes. Donal was dead. This was what would fill the woman's mind when he entered her house. Donal was dead. It was the thought that had excluded all else from life for her, though he knew she had gone on working as other broken women had done. What did people say to women whose sons had been dead and had come back to life? It had happened before. What could one say to prepare them for the transcendent shock of joy? What preparation could there be? "God help me," he said to himself with actual devoutness as he stood at the door. He had seen Helen Muir once or twice since the news of her loss had reached her, and she had looked like a most beautiful ghost and shadow of herself. When she came into her drawing room to meet him, she was more of a ghost and shadow than when they had last met, and he saw her lips quiver at the mere sight of him, though she came forward very quietly. Whatsoever helped him in response to his unconscious appeal brought to him suddenly a wave of comprehension of her and of himself as creatures unexpectedly near each other as they had never been before. The feeling was remotely akin to what had awakened in him by the pure gravity and tenderness of Robin's baptismal good-bye kiss. He was human. She was human. They had both been forced to bear suffering. He was bringing joy to her. He met her almost as she entered the door. He made several quick steps and he took both her hands in his and held them. It was a thing so unheard of that she stopped and stood quite still, looking up at him. "Come and sit down here," he said, drawing her towards the sofa, and he did not let her hands go, and sat down at her side, while she stared at him and her breath began to come and go quickly. "What?" she began. "You are changed quite different." "Yes, I am changed. Everything is changed for us both." "For us?" She touched her breast weakly. "For me as well as you?" "Yes," he answered, and he still held her hands protectingly and kept his altered eyes, the eyes of a strangely new man, upon her. They were living, human, longing to help her, who had so long condemned him. His hands were even warm and held hers as if to give her support. "You are a calm, well balanced woman," he said, "and joy does not kill people, even hurt them." There could be only one joy, only one, and she knew he knew there could be no other. She sprang from her seat. "Donal!" she cried out so loud that the room rang. "Donal! Donal!" He was on his feet also because he still, wonderfully, did not let her go. "He is at my house. He has been there for weeks because we have had to fight for his life. We should have called you if he had been dying. Only an hour ago the doctor in charge gave me permission to come to you. You may see him for a few minutes." She began to tremble and sat down. "I shall be quiet soon," she said. "Oh, dear God 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 Donal!" Tears swept down her cheeks, but he saw her begin to control herself even the next moment. "May I speak to him at all?" she asked. "Kiss him and tell him you are waiting in the next room and can come back any moment. What the hospital leaves free of Coombe House is at your disposal." "God bless you! Oh, forgive me!" "He escaped from a German prison by some miracle. He must be made to forget. He must hear of nothing but happiness. There is happiness before him enough to force him to forget. You will accept anything he tells you as if it were a natural thing?" "Accept!" she cried. "What would I not accept, praising God! You are preparing me for something. Ah, don't be afraid. But is it maiming? Darkness?" "No, no. It is a perfect thing. You must know it before you see him. And be ready. Before he went to the front he was married." "Married!" in a mere breath. Coombe went on in quick sentences. She must be prepared and she could bear anything in the rapture of her joy. "He married in secret a lonely child whom the Dowager Duchess of Darte had taken into her household. We have both taken charge of her since we discovered she was his wife. We thought she was his widow. She has a son. Before her marriage she was Robin Gareth Lawless." "Ah!" she cried brokenly. "He would have told me. He wanted to tell me, but he could not, because I was so hard. Oh, poor motherless children!" "You never were hard, I could swear," Coombe said. "But perhaps you have changed as I have. If he had not thought I was hard he might have told me. Shall we go to him at once?" Together they went without a moment's delay. Chapter XLII of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter XLII. The dream had come back and Robin walked about the moor carrying her baby in her arms, even though Dowie followed her. She laid him on the heather and let him listen to the skylarks, and there was in her face such a look that, in times past if she had seen it, Dowie would have believed that it could only mean translation from earth. But when Lord Coombe came for a brief visit he took Dowie to walk alone with him upon the moor. When they set out together she found herself involuntarily stealing furtive sidelong glances at him. There was that in his face which drew her eyes in spite of her. It was a look so intense and new that once she caught her breath, trembling. It was then that he turned to look at her and began to talk. He began and went on, and as she listened there came to her sudden flooding tears and more than once a loud, startled sob of joy. "But he begs that she shall not see him until he is less ghastly to behold. He says the memory of such a face would tell her things she must never know. His one thought is that she must not know. Things happen to a man's nerves when he has seen and borne the ultimate horrors. Men have gone mad under the prolonged torture. He sometimes has moments of hideous collapse when he cannot shut out certain memories. He is more afraid of such times than of anything else. He feels he must get hold of himself." Dowie's step slackened until it stopped. Her almost awed countenance told him what she felt she must know or perish. He felt that she had her rights and one of them was the right to be told. She had been a strong tower of honest faith and love. "My lord, might I ask if you have told him all about it?" "Yes, Dowie," he answered. "All is well and no one but ourselves will ever know. The marriage in the dark old church is no longer a marriage. Only the first one, which he can prove, stands." The telling of his story to Donal had been a marvellous thing because he had so controlled its drama that it had even been curiously undramatic. He had made it a mere catalogued statement of facts. As Donal had lain listening his heart had seemed to turn over in his breast. "If I had known you," he panted low. "If we had known each other. We did not." Later, bit by bit, he told him of Jackson. Only of Jackson. He never spoke of other things. When put together the bit by bit amounted to this. He was a queer, simple sort of American. He was full of ideals and a kind of unbounded belief in his country. He had enlisted in Canada at the beginning. He always believed America would come in. He was sure the Germans knew she would, and that was why they hated Americans. The more they saw her stirred up, the more they hated the fellows they caught, and the worse they treated them. They were hellish to Jackson. He had stopped at this point, and Coombe had noted a dreaded look dawning in his eyes. "Don't go on, my boy. It's bad for you," he broke in. Donal shook his head a little as if to shake something away. "I won't go on with that," he said. "But the dream I must tell you about that. It saved me from going mad and Jackson did. He believed in a lot of things I'd not heard of except as jokes. He called them New Thought and Theosophy and Christian Science. He wasn't clever but he believed and it helped him. When I'm stronger I'll try to tell you. Subconscious mind and astral body came into it. I had begun to see things just through starvation and agony. I told him about Robin when I scarcely knew what I was saying. He tried to hold me quiet by saying her name to me over and over. He'd pull me up with it. He began to talk to me about dreaming. When your body's not fed, you begin to see clear if your spirit is not held down. He was getting tired and panting a little. Coombe bent nearer to him. "I can guess the rest. I have been reading books on such subjects. He told you how to concentrate on dreaming and try to get near her. He helped you by suggestion himself. He used to lie awake night after night and do it. And I began to dream. No, it was not a dream. I believe I got to her. He did it. And they killed him." "Hush! Hush!" cried Coombe. "Of all men he would most ardently implore you to hold yourself still." Donal made some strange effort. He lay still. "Yes, he would. Yes. Of all the souls in the other world he'd be strongest. He saved me. He saved Robin. He saved the child. You. All of us. Perhaps he's here now. He said he'd come if he could. He believed he could." He lay quiet for a few seconds and then Donal's smile they had all adored lighted up his face. "Jackson, old chap," he said, "I can't see you, but I'll do what you want me to do. I'll do it." He fainted the next minute and the doctors came to him. The facts which came later still were that Jackson had developed consumption and exposure and brutality had done their worst. And Donal had seen his heart-wringing end. But he knew America would come in. I believed it too, because he did, just at the right time. All the rest have fought like mad till they're tired, though they'll die fighting," he said. "America's not tired. She's got everything and she sees red with frenzy at the bestiality. She'll burst in just at the right time. Jackson knew." "I must not go trembling to her," Donal said on the morning when at last, long last, it seemed, he drove with Coombe up the moor road to Darreuch. "But," bravely, "what does it matter? I'm trembling because I'm going to her." He had been talking about her for weeks. For days he had been able to talk of nothing else. Coombe had listened as if he heard echoes from a past when he would have so talked and dared not utter a word. He had talked as a boy lover talks, as a young bridegroom might let himself pour his joy forth to his most sacredly trusted friend. Her loveliness, the velvet of her lifting eyes, the wonder of her trusting soul, the wonder of her unearthly, selfless sweetness. It was always the same kind of marvel every time you saw her, he said boyishly. You couldn't believe there could be such sweetness on earth until you saw her again. Even her eyes and her little mouth and her softness were like that. You had to tell yourself about them over and over again to make them real when she wasn't there. He was still thin, but the ghastly hollows had filled and his smile scarcely left his face, and he had waited as long as he could. "And to see her with a little child in her arms," he had murmured. "Robin holding it and being careful and showing it to me." After he first caught sight of the small old towers of Darreuch he could not drag his eyes from them. "She's there! She's there! They're both there together!" he said over and over. Just before they left the carriage he wakened as it were and spoke to Coombe. "She won't be frightened," he said. "I told her last night." Coombe had asked himself if he must go to her, but marvellously even to him there was no need. When they stood in the dark little hall, as she had come down the stone stairway on the morning when she bade him her sacred little good bye, so she came down again, like a white blossom drifting down from its branch, like a white feather from a dove's wing. But she held her baby in her arms, and to Donal her cheeks and lips and eyes were as he had first seen them in the Gardens. He trembled as he watched her and even found himself spellbound, waiting. "Donal! Donal!" And they were in his arms, the soft warm things, and he sat down upon the lowest step and held them, rocking and trembling still more, but with the gates of peace open and earth and war shut out. The End. Chapter 42. Recording by Linda Andrus, Waukesha, Wisconsin, 2012. End of Robin by Frances Hodgson Burnett.